Every piece of ebony armor and every ebony weapon in these games is dried god blood. That's not a fan theory sitting on some forum somewhere. It's written directly into the lore, and there's an actual town in Skyrim built around an ebony mine where the miners call the ore exactly what the old story says it is: the blood of Shor. What follows is a long run of lesser known Elder Scrolls facts, one after another, covering more of the world than the games ever explain on their own. Every elf in Tamriel, no matter how different they look now, comes from the same starting point. The Aldmer, the first folk, were the original Mer, and every elven people alive today split off from them at some point in the deep past. That includes the High Elves, the Wood Elves, the Dark Elves, the Sea Elves, the Orcs, and even the half-elven Bretons of High Rock. None of it happened all at once. It took thousands of years and a lot of separate decisions by separate groups, but the root is the same. The Aldmer are said to have come from a place called Aldmeris, a lost continent that doesn't show up on any map anymore. Some sources, including apparently the Elder Scrolls themselves, treat Aldmeris as more of a story than a real place, so nobody can really say it existed. What's better documented is where the Aldmer ended up: the Somerset Isles, first settled by a lord named Torinan, and from there out across the rest of Tamriel, much of it charted by an explorer called Topol the Pilot. The Aldmer had bronze skin, and modern Altmer are considered the closest living match to what they looked like and how they lived, partly because Altmer society still keeps up old Altmeri customs on purpose. Some accounts even say Altmer practiced a kind of selective breeding to hold on to Altmer features. They also kept a system of musical notation from that era that's still hard to read today. The elves didn't split up because a war broke out or a plague hit. Some accounts describe it as something closer to a realization. The Aldmer noticed that different towers, structures like the Adamantine Tower on the Isle of Balfiera or the Crystal Tower on Somerset, could each tell reality a different story and shape the world differently depending on which one a person followed. Groups of Aldmer picked their own tower and their own path, and over time they just became different peoples. The Bosmer are said to have followed towers into Valenwood. The Kemmer followed something called Redheart into Morrowind. The Altmer stayed home and followed what's called crystal-like law. Whatever the actual mechanism was, the result is that within a few thousand years, Aldmer wasn't one people anymore. One of the clearest examples of a splinter group is the Aelids, sometimes called the Heartland High Elves. They left Somerset Isle in the Merathic era, some of them specifically to get away from Aldmeri rules that banned worshipping Daedra. They settled what's now Cyrodiil. They built the first empire Tamriel ever had, long before any human nation existed. Their capital temple, the Temple of the Ancestors, was built in imitation of the Direni's Adamantine Tower, and it still stands today. It's what the Empire now calls the White Gold Tower. The Aelids were said to be obsessed with the number 8, which might be part of why the pantheon Saint Alessia put together afterward, the 8 divines, ended up with 8 gods in it. Aelid rule lasted for centuries, and it wasn't gentle. They enslaved the native human population of Cyrodiil, the Nedes, for generations. Then Alessia's slave rebellion tore the empire down. The tower fell in their hands in the year the First Era, 243, and the Aelids scattered. A few tribes may have lingered in the wild corners of Cyrodiil for a long time after, but by the late Third Era, the most recent reported sighting was already more than 1,000 years old. As far as anyone can say, the Aelids are gone. Another splinter group, the Direni, took a very different path and are still around in some form today. They came from a small farming village called Tyrigel on Somerset Isle, and sometime in the Middle Merethic era they crossed the sea to the Iliac Bay and eventually took control of the Adamantine Tower on the Isle of Balfiera. Unlike the Aelids in Cyrodiil, the Direni didn't enslave the native humans of High Rock, the Nedes. They ruled them as a noble class instead, took Nedic concubines, and over generations that produced a mixed people who eventually became known as the Bretons. That's a big enough story to get its own chapter later. Morrowind ended up with two separate elven peoples who both trace back to the same Aldmer root, the Dwemer and the Kimmer, the second of which are the direct ancestors of today's Dunmer. The Chimer's change into the Dunmer came from one specific event, not a slow drift, and that gets its own chapter too. Farther south, another branch of Aldmer left Somerset, or left Aldmeris itself, sources don't agree on which, and became the Maormer, the sea elves who still rule an entire continent called Piandonea that most people who've played these games have never even heard of. And the orcs didn't split off through migration or slow cultural drift at all. Their split was a punishment, one that turned a group of Trinimac's Altmer followers into something else entirely, body and mind, in a single event. That one's next. A few individual Aldmer are remembered by name outside of all this splitting. Orgnum, once an ordinary Aldmer, became the undying sorcerer king who still rules the Maormer to this day. And the necromancer Manimarco, the king of worms, used to insist he wasn't an Altmer at all, that he was Aldmer, full stop, as if the older name meant something the newer one didn't. None of the elven peoples above are really separate inventions. They're what's left after one people spent a few thousand years splitting itself apart by geography, religion, and in at least one case, a curse. Keeping that straight matters, because a lot of what looks strange about orcs, Bretons, Dunmer, and the Sea Elves nobody talks about only makes sense once the shared starting point is in view. That curse is worth its own chapter, because it's the origin of an entire people. Before there were orcs, there was Trinimac, one of the Aldmer's own ancestor spirits, called the Warrior, the Paragon, and the Golden Champion. In some tellings he was more popular than Auriel himself, and he's remembered as Auriel's greatest knight, a warrior spirit who led the early elves into battle and was said to be the strongest of all the Etada who walked on Nirn. He carried a sword called Penitent, also known as Voshrach, the Blade of Courage. During the Merathic era, the Daedric prince Boethia began appearing to a prophet named Veloth, pushing him to break away and start what would become the Chimer. Trinimac's priests saw this as blasphemy and were ready to punish the dissidents for it. According to the most widely told version of what happened next, Boethia stopped them by getting rid of Trinimac first. She appeared to him as a beautiful woman, asked for a kiss, and when he leaned in, she swallowed him whole. Then she wore his shape and his voice in front of his own followers, made him look ridiculous doing it, and eventually vomited out what was left of him as proof that the great champion was gone. Trinimac, twisted and tortured inside her, was released and banished to a realm of oblivion that became known as the Ash Pit. There he faded away, and something enraged and vengeful took his place, Malakath. His most devoted followers changed along with him, transformed into the Orsimer, the pariah folk, known today as the Orcs. That's the popular version, but it isn't the only one, and Elder Scrolls lore doesn't pretend it's settled. Some Orcs reject it outright and believe Trinimac is still out there somewhere, a separate being from Malakath entirely. In this view, Malakath is a liar who has him locked away. Others tell a version where Trinimac actually won. He fooled Boethia into thinking she'd broken him, secretly kept some of the power he absorbed from her, and passed it on to his followers, making the Orsimer improved elves instead of cursed ones. A different Orcish telling has Trinimac dueling Boethia directly, getting stabbed in the back by Mephala mid-fight, and then tearing his own chest open in fury to rip the shame out of his own spirit and remake himself as Mauloch. Even the names split along these lines. Some call him Mauloch and treat him as an Aedra, kin to Trinimac. Others call him Malakath and treat him as a Daedra, the thing that came after Trinimac was destroyed. The Empire and its scholars mostly go with the Boethia ate him version. A significant number of orcs, including at least two of Orsinium's own kings, Kurog and Gortwag Gronagorm, spent real political capital during their reigns trying to bring back Trinimac worship instead of Malakath's, and both times the shift didn't survive them. Whatever actually happened in the Merethic era, what followed for the orcs afterward is much better documented, and it's rough. For most of Tamriel's recorded history, orcs weren't treated as people by their neighbors. They were hunted, pushed off land, and generally regarded as little better than beasts. Tiber Septim, who built the Third Empire, hated orcs personally and refused to grant them citizenship, which meant orcs had none of the legal protections other subjects of the empire had for a very long time. It took centuries, and a lot of orcish blood spent fighting in the Imperial Legion before that started to change. Orsinium itself tells the same story in miniature. The first Orsinium was founded in the Hrothgarian mountains by a chieftain named Toruk Gro Igron, sometime around the 9th or 10th century of the First Era, after orc clans pushed out of Valenwood and Hammerfell needed somewhere to go. It didn't last. In the First Era, 948, an alliance of Daggerfall, the Order of Diagna, and Sentinel destroyed it in what's remembered as the First Siege of Orsinium. A second Orsinium was recognized as imperial territory under the Akaviri potentate Severian Korak, and it lost that protection the moment he was assassinated, getting sacked again the following year by the Bretons of Shornhelm. A third Orsinium, sometimes called Nova Orsinium, was built up by King Gortwag Gro-Nagorm late in the Third Era, strong enough that an emperor was forced to recognize it as equal to the other kingdoms of the Iliac Bay. Even that one was destroyed again early in the Fourth Era, this time by Redguards and Bretons together, though that time the Imperial Legion actually stepped in on the orc side and helped resettle the survivors. Orsinium got rebuilt once more in the mountains between Hammerfell and Skyrim. By the time of the Great War, orcs were finally integrated into the empire as full citizens. It took 3 cities and roughly 3,000 years to get there. The Bosmer of Valenwood live under a religious code called the Green Pact, sometimes called the Treaty of Frond and Leaf. It's not a suggestion. The rules are plain. Don't harm the forests of Valenwood, don't eat anything made from plant life, eat only meat, and when an enemy is killed, their meat has to be eaten, not left to rot. Don't kill wastefully. Don't take on the shape of a beast. Every part of that list connects to the next part, and together they explain something about Bosmer culture that outsiders usually find shocking on its own, but that actually makes a strange kind of sense once the whole picture is in view. Start with the diet. If a people truly can't harm a single living plant in their own homeland, they can't farm, and they can't really eat vegetables or fruit unless it's already fallen off the tree on its own. That leaves meat as close to the only option there is. Dairy, honey, mushrooms, and insects are generally allowed too, and fallen fruit is fine as long as the seeds get replanted. Still, the core of the diet has to be animal, and when your enemies die on your own land, the pact doesn't let you just leave the meat to rot, because that counts as waste. So, the fallen, including enemies killed in battle, traditionally get eaten, usually within 3 days, often by the family of whoever did the killing. This isn't treated as a taboo the way it would be almost anywhere else in Tamriel. It's treated as a religious obligation, a meat mandate, and failing to carry it out is the actual violation. The practice has faded a lot since the Second Era, and now mostly survives in the most remote and traditional villages. It was never framed as something shameful, though. It was framed as respect for the forest that can't be harmed any other way. Breaking the pact has real consequences in Bosmer belief, not just social disapproval. Bosmer, who violate it, called apostates, are said to be cast into something called the Ooze after death, a formless, purgatorial state that existed before the god Y'ffre gave shape and story to the world. Being stuck in the ooze means being cut out of the story of Tamriel entirely, unable to interact with the living world or reach any real afterlife, just watching everything happen forever. If the forest itself is harmed, the clan responsible for that stretch of land has to hold a trial, and whoever's found guilty is sacrificed to the Green, no matter how small their part in it was. The Green Pact doesn't apply to non-Bosmer legally, but some Bosmer treat outsiders damaging plant life as its own kind of crime against nature anyway, which has caused plenty of friction with Valenwood's neighbors over the centuries. One more piece of the pact is worth mentioning here and nothing more: the Wild Hunt. In dire circumstances, a group of Bosmer can perform a ritual that turns them into a horde of shape-shifting, flesh-eating monsters that tear through everything in their path, an act the Bosmer see as a deliberate return to the formless ooze the pact normally protects them from. The change can't be undone, and it isn't something the Bosmer are proud of or willing to talk about much. It's the extreme end of a belief system that otherwise governs something as basic as what's on the dinner table. The Bretons of High Rock aren't human with a bit of elven flavor added for style. By tradition and by the in-world explanation of their own name, they're an actual hybrid people, born from centuries of interbreeding between the native humans of High Rock, retroactively called the Nedis or the Druids of Galen, and a clan of Altmer who settled there called House Direni. The word Breton itself comes from an old word, beratu, that simply means half. Scholars still argue about who was in High Rock first, the Nedis or the Direni, but nobody disputes that the mixing happened starting as far back as the Merethic era. House Direni came over from Somerset Isle in the Middle Merethic era and eventually took control of the adamantine tower on the Isle of Balfiera. Unlike the Aelids down in Cyrodiil, the Direni didn't enslave the Nedis outright. They ruled over them as a noble class instead, set up a feudal system with the Nedis as vassals. Taking Nedic concubines was a matter of course. The children born from those pairings were called Manmer, or half-elves, and they weren't accepted by their Direni parents as equals. The Direni saw them as submer. So the mixed children ended up raised among the Nedis instead, given a privileged spot in Nedic society. Over generations, that became a distinct people, the Bretons. Early Bretons looked a lot more elven than the ones around today, with pointed ears, angled faces, and slender bodies, and the shift toward a more human appearance happened gradually enough that nobody can point to a date when it was complete. Even now, some Bretons are born with visibly pointed ears, and Druidic Bretons still call themselves Manmer on purpose, as a way of holding on to that half of their ancestry instead of hiding it. Clan Direni went on to build something called the Direni Hegemony, a genuine elven-ruled state that at its height controlled all of High Rock and reached into parts of Skyrim and Hammerfell. It held for generations before it finally collapsed around the end of the First Era, worn down by wars with the Nords and the Alessian Empire. Once the Direni withdrew to Balfiera, High Rock didn't become one unified Breton nation. It splintered into something like 100 competing fiefdoms, each ruled by nobility that claimed descent, directly or not, from that same elven blood. That obsession with lineage, titles, and status that still defines Breton politics is described in the lore as a direct inheritance from those days as Direni vassals. The elven blood is also where the most useful thing about being a Breton comes from, an inborn talent for magic, and a natural resistance to magical and destructive energy that isn't tied to elven ancestry specifically, but shows up in Bretons more than in other humans. Bretons are considered, by at least one in-world source, the second best sorcerers in Tamriel after the Altmer themselves, and children across High Rock are tested for magical potential from a young age, with the promising ones funneled into apprenticeships. It's such a normal part of life that kids in cities like Daggerfall practice illusion spells on each other in the street. That combination, human lifespans with elven magical aptitude built into the blood, is what makes the Bretons truly different from every other human population in Tamriel, and it traces straight back to a clan of Altmer who crossed the sea and decided High Rock's natives made more useful vassals than slaves. Most people who've only played the games think of Khajiit as one look, a furred, digitigrade cat person about the size of a man or woman. That's actually just one variety among many, called the Sutai Rat, and it happens to be the one the games show because it's the most common type seen outside elsewhere. The full picture is much stranger. There are 17 distinct first stocks of Khajiit. Which one any individual Khajiit turns out to be has nothing to do with what shape their parents were. It's set by something else entirely, the position of the moons at the moment of birth. Khajiit morphology is tied to the phases of the two moons, Maser and Secunda, called Joan and Jode in the Khajiiti tongue, and to something called the lunar lattice, or the Jakaje. Every Khajiit's shape gets locked in at birth according to where the moon stood that night. It stays that way for the rest of their life. It isn't shape-shifting, and it isn't inherited. Two cubs born to the same two parents, just weeks apart under a different moon phase, can come out as two completely different animals, and Khajiiti society treats that as entirely normal. At the small end, there's the Alfik, a quadrupedal furstock about the size of an ordinary house cat. Outsiders often assume Alfik are mute or unintelligent because they look exactly like a house pet, and some people even try to pick them up and cuddle them, which the Alfik find deeply insulting. They can talk just fine, they're magically gifted, and some of them can even cast spells through their tails. Because of the disrespect they get outside elsewhere, most Alfik don't travel much, though a few use the fact that outsiders underestimate them to work as spies. At the opposite end of the size range is the Senche, and its larger cousin, the Senche Rat, both quadrupedal furstocks big enough to ride. A Senche Rat is described as standing as tall as two Altmer stacked up and weighing as much as 50 of them, though that's probably an exaggeration. They're intelligent, capable of speech and spellcasting, and while some do serve as mounts, they dislike being treated as property and would rather be seen as equals than as a means of transport. Some have gone on to become successful merchants in their own right. In between, there's a whole range of other forms. The Cathay and Cathay Rat are bipedal and roughly the size of a typical man or mer, with the Cathay Rat nicknamed Jaguar Man by Imperials, even though most of them don't actually look much like jaguars. The Pahmar and Pahmaracht are giant, powerfully built bipedal Khajiit who resemble tigers and are usually put to work as bodyguards and warriors. Outsiders tend to write them off as brutes, but Khajiit themselves know plenty of Pahmar who are gentle by nature. The Dagi and Dagirat are small, lynx-faced Khajiit who live in the jungles and marshes of southern elsewhere and are light enough to live in tree branches too high for a Bosmer to reach. And then there's the Omes and Omesrat, who look almost nothing like the popular image of a Khajiit at all. They resemble elves, specifically Bosmer, closely enough that many of them paint or tattoo their faces with feline markings just so they aren't mistaken for something else entirely. The Omesrat in particular are said to be the first stock that most resembles men, and some Khajiiti legend even claims Lorkhaj had Azura shape them that way on purpose, to walk among human kings and guide them. All of this variation exists inside one people who consider every first stock equally Khajiit, even if outsiders don't always extend the same respect. The Mane, the spiritual and political head of the entire Khajiiti race, is its own separate case on top of all of this, born only under a rare alignment of Maser and Secunda that legend says briefly reveals a third moon in the sky. From the 4th era, 98, to the 4th era, 100, both of Nirn's moons, Maser and Secunda disappeared from the sky. Not eclipsed, not dimmed, gone for 2 full years. Across the empire, this caused general dread and confusion, since the moons were tied to all sorts of cultural and religious meaning for a lot of peoples. In Elsewhere, it was worse than dread. Given that a Khajiit's shape is set at birth by which moon phase they're born under, 2 years with no moons at all meant something closer to a reproductive catastrophe than a bad omen. There was no version of the usual process to point to anymore. After 2 years, the moons came back, and the Thalmor announced they were the ones who'd brought them back, using something they called dawn magics. Whether that claim was actually true is unresolved. There's no way to confirm the Thalmor did anything at all to restore the moons, as opposed to simply knowing in advance that the moons were going to return on their own and timing the announcement to take the credit. Either way, the Khajiit believed them and credited the Thalmor as their saviors. That belief did real political damage almost immediately. Within 15 years, imperial influence in Elsewhere had shrunk so much that the empire couldn't do anything to stop a coup in the Fourth Era, 115, that dissolved the Elsewhere Confederacy and recreated the old kingdoms of Anakina and Palatine as client states of the Aldmeri Dominion. A province that had been part of the empire ended up on the other side of a war that hadn't even started yet, and the Void Knights are a direct part of how that happened. Only one Khajiit at a time can be the Mane, the spiritual leader and temporal ruler of the entire Khajiiti people. Khajiit tradition holds that there's really only ever been one Mane, reborn again and again into different bodies across the centuries, and there's never been a recorded case of 2 Manes contending for the position at once. Though, whether that's because the belief is literally true, or because a sitting Mane deals with any rival before it becomes a problem, isn't something anyone can say for certain. A Mane can only be born under a rare alignment of Maser and Secunda, an eclipse under which legend says a third, hidden moon briefly appears. Other Khajiit, born under that same eclipse, who aren't the one chosen to be Mane, are called Forgotten Manes. Most of them are handed over to the Pride of Alkosh at Pridehome and raised as warriors instead, kept close to the moons but also more exposed to their darker side, the Dark Moon and the corruption that comes from it. Some Forgotten Manes hold that off, others don't. Being born under the eclipse doesn't guarantee a happy story. The Dark Mane, an early Mane whose reign is only vaguely dated, is remembered as having listened too much to the Darks, and his soul was ultimately claimed by the Daedric prince Namira, which made him unfit to lead and got him cast out of the moon's light for good, walking in darkness from then on. Historical records of named Manes are patchy, with long gaps between them, some spanning centuries with no one clearly identified as holding the title, which suggests that either the office sat empty for long stretches or nobody bothered writing the name down. When a Mane dies, especially by violence, the effect on Elsewhere is immediate and bad. Around the Fourth Era, 48, the ruling Mane was assassinated by the Thalmor, and the south of Elsewhere fell into chaos as a direct result. That assassination happened only about 50 years before the Void Knights, and the two events together track the same story from 2 different angles. A Khajiiti nation losing its spiritual anchor and its literal moons within the same 2 generations, both times at the Thalmor's hands or with the Thalmor's fingerprints somewhere on it, and both times ending with Elsewhere further from the Empire and closer to the Dominion. Deep in the swamps of Black Marsh grow the Hist, giant spore trees that Argonians consider more ancient than any race of man or mer. The Hist aren't just plants that happen to be sacred, they're described as a sentient species in their own right, and all of them, everywhere, are connected at the root and share one collective mind. Argonians call themselves people of the root, and that isn't just a figure of speech. An Argonian's life starts inside that connection, not after it. Eggs are typically incubated in pools of Hist sap, and the Hist takes an active part in the hatching process itself. In some regions, dedicated egg tenders watch over the nests, but it's the hist that actually guides how each hatchling develops and what shape it takes. If the connection between a clutch of eggs and the hist gets cut off somehow, the unborn Argonians inside die. Argonians who happen to be born outside Black Marsh can't hear the hist at all, which tells you the bond isn't just spiritual, it's practical and immediate. Once hatched, a young Argonian licks the hist and is given a name. Throughout their life, drinking the hist sap lets it communicate with them directly through visions, and it can sharpen their fighting ability too, though drinking too much of it is dangerous even for Argonians who are used to it. Put together, that means an individual Argonian isn't really separate from the hist the way a human is separate from a tree they happen to worship. They're closer to an extension of the same organism, shaped by it from before birth, named through it, and capable of hearing it think. That's not a metaphor scholars came up with afterward. It's how the relationship is described from the inside. The clearest proof of how far that connection reaches came in the Third Era, year 433, during the Oblivion Crisis, when Mehrunes Dagon tried to invade Tamriel. The hist foresaw it coming and called Argonians back to Black Marsh from across the Empire to defend their homeland, not as a suggestion, but as something the hist could apparently make happen directly. The hist also altered the Argonians who answered, making them faster, stronger, and able to take more punishment than usual. When the Oblivion Gates opened in Black Marsh, the Argonians threw themselves into them with so much ferocity that Dagon's own lieutenants had to shut the gates to keep from being overrun. Black Marsh came out of the Oblivion Crisis more united and stronger than it went in, at a time when almost every other province in Tamriel came out worse off. One more thing gets a single mention here. The Argonians are widely rumored, though never proven, to be behind the Knahaten flu of the Second Era, 560, a plague that devastated Tamriel while leaving Argonians completely immune, which most other races took as proof that a history had engineered it in retaliation for generations of Dunmer slave raids. Redguards are the newest of Tamriel's major races. By the lore's own accounting, every other race on the continent was already established before they showed up. They came from somewhere else entirely, a continent called Yokuda, out past the Western Sea, once said to be roughly 4 times the size of Tamriel and covered in desert. Life there was violent for centuries. Yokuda went through hundreds of years of nearly continuous civil war between rival lords, and out of that chaos grew a martial tradition called sword singing, the way of the sword, where warriors sought strength of mind as much as strength of body. The greatest of them were called Ansei, sword saints, and the single most accomplished sword singer in Yokudan history was a man named Frandar Hunding. Eventually, an emperor named Hira tried to wipe the sword singers out entirely. They were badly outnumbered, but they fought back, and the conflict became known as the War of the Singers. It ended in the First Era, 780, at the foot of Hatu Mountain, where Hunding's small army crushed Hira's forces using a strategy remembered as the hammer and the anvil. It worked, but it cost more than 300,000 lives in the final battle alone. Afterward, the survivors' guardians were said to be red with blood, and that image is where the name Redguard comes from. Whether directly or as a folk memory layered on top of the more mundane explanation that scholars prefer, that Redguard is simply a corruption of Ragada, meaning warrior wave. Yokuda didn't survive much longer after that. Around the First Era, 792, the whole continent sank into the sea. Nobody agrees on why. Some accounts blame natural disaster, earthquakes, or volcanic eruptions on a continent that was already prone to tremors. Others blame a defeated band of Ansei called the Hiradirj, said to be masters of stone magic, who supposedly took revenge on Yokuda for their loss in the civil wars, using a forbidden sword technique capable of unmaking the laws of nature. A separate tradition says the Yokudans had simply drifted away from their gods, performed forbidden rites, and summoned something that should never have been called, so the god Satakal rose up out of the sea and pulled the whole continent under. Whichever version is true, the result was the same. Frandar Hunding and his sword singers had already left before the end, sailing east across the ocean in what's remembered as the first of 4 warrior wave migrations. And when the continent finally went under, everyone left behind had no choice but to follow. The Ragada who landed in Hammerfell weren't gentle settlers. They fought off a goblin invasion almost immediately, then turned on the people already living there, the Nedis, Bretons, and various Mer, along with the native beast folk, killing or enslaving what resistance they met. Within a few brutal months, they'd carved out a strong foothold along the western coast, pushed out the Nordic and Imperial raiders who'd been working that stretch of coastline for generations, and cleared the way for Yokudan royalty to arrive safely. Most of the old cities in the region that predate the Red Guards were originally Dwemer cities, later taken over and remade into what's now modern Hammerfell. Atmora sits north of Tamriel on the map, and by tradition it's where the first humans came from, ancestors not just of the Nords but of the Bretons and the people of Serodil as well. It wasn't one single wave of settlers either. Groups of Atmorans crossed over in a series of migrations spread across hundreds of years, each new arrival clashing with whoever had already settled in before them. Tamriel worked as something like an outlet valve for Atmorans, who, for one reason or another, couldn't stay in Atmora any longer. The most famous of those migrations is Ysgramor's. Late in the Merethic era, while civil war raged back home, Ysgramor and his 2 sons, Ingol and Ylgar, sailed over with the fleet and founded the city of Sartal in what's now Winterhold. It didn't last. The Snow Elves massacred the settlers in what's remembered as the Night of Tears, and Ysgramor fled back to Atmora with his sons to gather an army for revenge. He returned with the 500 companions, landed at Xarik Head on Tamriel's northern coast, drove the Snow Elves out of the region, and finished the job on the island of Solstheim. The land the companions took became the foundation of what's now Skyrim. Atmorans kept trickling over for generations after that, in smaller and smaller numbers, and the last recorded arrival came in the First Era, 68, when 2 ships loaded with corpses begged to make port in Tamriel. After that, contact essentially stopped, and the reason is written right into Atmora's own geography. Around the time of Ysgramor's migration, the continent's climate started shifting for no clear reason, an event remembered as the Frostfall. It never stopped getting worse. Atmora had once been a green, if cold, land. It ended up buried under permanent winter. Some Nordic tellings blame the Snow Elves, framing the freeze as revenge for what the Atmorans did to them on Tamriel, but nobody can say for certain what actually caused it. What isn't in dispute is what expeditions found when they went looking. There were reports that Atmora was still inhabited as late as the early Third Era, but every expedition Tamriel sent north through the Middle and later Third Era came back with the same answer: nothing. No people, no sign of habitation, just permanent winter and cold gales blowing down towards Skyrim. Whoever didn't leave for Tamriel while they still could is believed to have died out with the land itself. Atmora isn't a myth or a lost paradise in the lore. It's a real place on the map, one that people can still sail to. Every ship that's gone has come back to report that there's nobody left to find. The people known today as the Dunmer used to be a different people entirely, and not in the slow, generations-long way the Aelids or the Bosmer split off from the Aldmer. The Chimer, as they were called, looked close to Altmer, with pale golden skin, and they'd left Somerset following a prophet named Veloth and the teachings of Boethia, Mephala, and Azura, building an entire culture in Morrowind around ancestor worship and a deliberate break from Aldmeri tradition. Then, in a single event, their skin turned ash black and their eyes turned red, all across a living population at once. That's not a metaphor for cultural change. That's what the lore says physically happened. The event traces back to the Battle of Red Mountain, fought after the Kimmer and the Dwemer, once allies under the First Council, went to war over something the Dwemer had discovered called the Heart of Lorkhan. A few years after that battle, the Tribunal, 3 Kimmer who'd used the power from the heart to make themselves into living gods, broke an oath they'd sworn, and the curse followed. The Chimer's transformation into the Dunmer is directly tied to that broken oath, though the lore doesn't dwell on the exact mechanics of what the Tribunal did or didn't do to trigger it. Not every Chimer changed the same way. Sota Sil, one of the 3 members of the Tribunal, could apparently have resisted the curse but chose to accept the new Dunmer look anyway. Vivek, another of the 3, ended up split down the middle, part Kimmer and part Dunmer at once. Almalexia, the 3rd, kept her old Kimmery skin tone and never took on the Dunmer appearance at all. Not every Dunmer even considers the change a punishment. Some see the darker, ash-toned skin as a mark of honor instead, tied to the Tribunal's ascension rather than a curse laid on them for failure. And when the Dunmer eventually stopped worshipping the Tribunal after the Red Year, and went back to honoring Azura and the other good Daedra they'd followed out of Somerset in the first place, they weren't changed back. One explanation offered for that is that Boethia had specifically instructed the Chimer, back at the very start of their exodus, to take on the color of bruise as a permanent reminder of what leaving Somerset actually cost, and pain was supposed to stay visible on their skin no matter who they ended up worshipping. There's a whole branch of elves in Elder Scrolls lore that's never had a game built around it, the Maormer, or Sea Elves, who live on an island kingdom called Piandonea, far south of Somerset. According to the story told through tapestries in the Crystal Tower, their leader King Orgnum was once a wealthy Aldmer nobleman back in the original homeland of Aldmeris, who used his fortune to fund a rebellion against the ruling powers there. When it failed, he and his followers were banished across an impenetrable mist to Piandonia, and the mist did its job so well that Orgnum's people never troubled their old countrymen in Aldmeris again. They've spent a very long time troubling their new neighbors instead. There's scarcely a year across the First or Second Era when Maormer forces didn't raid the coastline of Somerset Isle, and by tradition every single one of those attacks was personally led by Orgnum himself, who's described as a deathless wizard who somehow grows more youthful, not older, with every century that passes. Every one of those invasions failed. The last major attempt came in the Third Era, 110, in what's remembered as the War of the Isle, when the combined navies of Somerset and the Empire, backed by storm magic from the Sigic Order, wiped out Orgnum's invading fleet so thoroughly that he was never able to put together another force strong enough to try again. Physically, Mormer read as elves, but not quite the ones anyone's used to. Their skin ranges from pearlescent white to blue. Some have gill-like features, and their most feared warriors, the Leviathans, are described as looking like the offspring of a sea elf and a sea serpent, hunched and scaled and strong enough to climb the side of a warship. Culturally, Orgnum's hatred of the Altmer isn't just policy, it's described as close to the entire reason Maormer society exists in the shape it does, with the goal of conquering Somerset shaping nearly everything about how their clans organize and train. It's an entire elven people, with its own language, its own magic, its own king who's been ruling since before recorded history started keeping close track of him, and it's set in the background of every Elder Scrolls game without ever once being the subject of one. Cyrodiil today has a temperate climate, the kind of green, rolling countryside players actually walk through in the games. but plenty of the province's own historical sources describe it as jungle, and this isn't the case of one confused writer. Early First Era sources, like the Hosirik Lays and the Tamerlane Tractates, describe Cyrodiil as covered in jungle foliage during the age of the Elite Empire. By the Second Era, 864, contemporary accounts, including the first edition of the Pocket Guide to the Empire, described the province as mostly endless jungle. And there are records placing jungle conditions in Cyrodiil as late as the Third Era, 427, only a handful of years before other sources call the climate temperate again. Nobody in world agrees on why. One Second Era scholar, Phrastus of Elinhir, argued in a book called The Heartland of Cyrodiil that the whole thing is a transcription error, that scribes across the centuries simply got the climate wrong when copying older texts. His rival, Lady Cinnabar of Tanith, rejected that in her own book, Subtropical Cyrodiil, a speculation, and proposed something much stranger, that the White Gold Tower itself, built by the Aelids with real metaphysical power running through it, actually reshapes Cyrodiil's climate to suit whoever is ruling from it. Under her theory, the Aelids, originally from the tropical Somerset Isles, shifted Cyrodiil toward jungle to match their own tastes. The province cooled again once men took power. A third account credits the shift to Tiber Septim directly, claiming he proclaimed the jungle gone once his empire was fully unified and that the land itself answered him. None of these explanations rules out both of the others being partly right, and the sources genuinely don't settle it. There's also at least one case of the jungle coming back on purpose instead of by mystery. Around the Second Era, 582, a cult of Bosmer called the Recollection, who believed the Aelids were their ancestors, deliberately grew a tropical forest called the Dawnwood near Skingrad in an attempt to reclaim what they saw as their old homeland, before they were stopped. A different piece of Elder Scrolls lore goes much deeper into exactly how and why Cyrodiil's climate keeps shifting, and this is just the plain version. The disagreement in the historical record is real, nobody has resolved it, and Cyrodiil has been described as jungle, temperate, and back again more than once across recorded history. The most widely repeated theory about where Nirn's two moons came from treats them as pieces of a dead god. A group called the Temple Zero Society proposes that Maser and Secunda each began as one of two halves of Lorkhan's flesh divinity, cast down onto Nirn at the moment his heart was torn out and he was destroyed. Under that reading, the moons are meant to be a permanent, visible reminder to mortals of a duty Lorkhan set for them, described in Altmeri terms as a cloven duality, a split between opposites like good and evil, being and nothingness, hung in the sky where nobody can avoid seeing it. The Temple Zero Society goes further and claims every other story about how the moons came to be is just a mythical degradation of this one true origin. Whether that claim is actually true is exactly the kind of thing nobody in Tamriel can settle, because there are other origin stories that don't agree with it at all, and one of the most different comes from the Khajiit. In Khajiiti belief, Joan and Jode aren't pieces of Lorkhan. They're described as the stillborn twins of the goddess Fadomai, kept alive as lit lanterns, one the lantern of love and one the lantern of mercy, tended first by Kanarthi and later by Azura, who relights them whenever they burn low. Lorkaj, the Khajiiti name for Lorkhan, is a separate figure in this version, not the source of the moons, but someone punished by them. Modern Khajiit belief holds that after Lorkaji's death, his body was hurled up to follow Joan and Jode across the sky forever, as a punishment rather than an origin. There's also a third moon in Khajiiti tradition, a hidden one that appears only during a rare alignment and is tied to the birth of the Mane, along with a dark moon connected to corrupting spirits called the Dro Matra, neither of which has any equivalent in the Lorkhan corpse theory at all. There's also a much smaller, more human-scale story that has nothing to do with either of those cosmic accounts. A Breton legend tells of two lovers, Shandar and Mara, killed trying to escape an arranged marriage and a death sentence, whom the goddess Mara placed in the sky afterward so their love could keep watch over the world at night. Some Altmer claim the moons were made by Sheogorath instead, which is its own kind of answer. None of these versions can all be literally true at once, and Elder Scrolls lore doesn't pick a winner. What everyone actually seems to agree on is much smaller. Two moons hang over Nirn. They're tied to real events on the ground, from Khajiit births to werewolf transformations to Hircine's great hunt turning Secunda blood red, and where they actually came from depends entirely on who's telling the story. This one isn't a theory or a fan reading, it's how the world of the games is built, laid out plainly across the lore itself, and it's worth walking through once because so much else depends on it. Nirn is the planet, the physical globe that holds Tamriel and every other continent. Mundus is bigger than that. Some sources use the two words as if they mean the same thing, but the more careful ones describe Mundus as the whole structure Nirn sits inside, the planet plus the planets around it, the moons, and everything else visible from the ground looking up. Those other planets in the sky aren't just scenery, they're described as the Aedra themselves, or rather their planes of existence as seen from the mortal world. Each one an infinite realm in its own right that only looks like a small round disk in the sky because a mortal mind isn't built to perceive its true size. Nirn sits at the center of this arrangement, with what's counted as 8 Dominion planets surrounding it, and the whole structure is sometimes called the Arena, because it's described as the place where the light of Aetherius and the darkness of Oblivion are constantly pressing against each other. The stars have their own explanation, and it connects back to how Nirn got made in the first place. When the spirits who built Nirn ran into trouble, since the world they were shaping kept killing off pieces of them as it came together, the architect of the project, Magnus, called it off and left, and most of the other spirits who'd been helping him left with him, becoming what's called the Magna-G. Their departure is described as tearing holes in the sky, and those holes are the stars, punctures in the barrier between Nirn and Aetherius, letting Aetherius's light leak through. The sun works the same way, just bigger, described as another puncture in that same barrier, the largest one, through which the light and influence of Aedra like Auriel still reaches down into the mortal world. None of this is framed in the source material as somebody's clever interpretation. It's presented as simply how the world works, the way a physics textbook states that light bends around mass. The planets are gods. The stars are the scars left by the gods who refuse to stay and finish the job. And Nirn, the actual dirt under Tamriel's feet, is only the small central piece of something called Mundus that's a great deal larger than the planet itself. Every Elder Scrolls game set in Cyrodiil puts the White Gold Tower at the center of the map, the seat of Imperial power. Most players probably assume Imperials built it. They didn't. It was raised by the earliest Aldmeri migrants to Cyrodiil back in the Middle Merethic era, and it belonged to their descendants, the Aelids, who called it the Temple of the Ancestors, and used it to house a set of sacred statues called the 10 Ancestors. It was built in direct imitation of the Adamantine Tower on Balfiera, the oldest known structure on Tamriel, and like that tower, it was constructed as one of Nirn's towers, a structure meant to tell its own story and shape reality within its own domain. The tower stayed in Aelid hands as an independent city-state from the very start of the First Era until the First Era, 243, when Alessia's slave rebellion took it by force during the final push of her uprising against Aelid rule. The 10 Ancestors were pulled out and scattered to other Aelid cities before the sacking, and by the Alessian Empire's own official account, Every other Aelid relic of arcane power inside was destroyed once the tower fell, though some accounts claim an Aelid king got away with the most important pieces beforehand. From that point on, under every human empire that followed, the tower became the imperial palace, the physical seat of whoever held the throne, right up through the modern era. What the tower is actually for goes beyond real estate. Because it copies the adamantine tower's design so closely, it's considered to hold the real power to alter reality, on the level of the other towers scattered across Tamriel, and it was built specifically to counteract what's described as a spiritual bleeding out of Mundus that started after the gods withdrew from the world at the convention, acting as a point where the mortal world can stay connected to the divine. Its throne room is described as existing partly outside normal time and space. And there are scholars who believe that removing enough of the stones embedded in its walls could unravel creation itself and let Mundus collapse back into oblivion. During the plane meld in the Second Era, Molag Bal's forces specifically tried to drag the tower into Cold Harbor, and the fear wasn't just about losing a building. Because the tower functions as a metaphysical anchor for so much of Mundus, pulling it into oblivion risked pulling the rest of Tamriel in behind it. None of that changes the planar fact underneath all of it, the literal center of imperial power, the building every emperor has ruled from for the entire span of recorded human history in Cyrodiil, is an elven ruin that nobody ever tore down. It was simply captured, renamed, and moved into. The Drew show up in the games as ugly, octopus-like creatures that attack from tide pools and caves. Legend gives them a much bigger history than that. According to various myths, the Drow once ruled the entire world as tyrants, from a domain called Lig, with Molag Bal himself serving as something like their chief, wearing a form close to theirs. One account, taught by Mankar Camoran, holds that the Drow kings enslaved the oceans of all Mundus from Lig before Mehrunes Dagon destroyed it in a previous Kalpa. None of this can be verified the way ordinary history can. It's myth stacked on myth, describing a civilization from so far back that it predates most of what's actually recorded about Tamriel's surface. What's left of that supposed empire by modern times is a lot smaller and stranger. Druch were historically ruled by figures called the Trident Kings as late as the Second Era, and there are still rumored underwater colonies and cities, along with legends of land-dwelling Droch colonies that raised herds of mud crabs for food and built stone cairn houses. Most of that is treated as folklore, not confirmed fact. Today, though at least one Drow colony encountered in the Second Era, in Fungal Grotto, was found with command over mud crabs and its own king, which suggests the old stories weren't pure invention. The strangest part of drug biology is the land drug players actually run into most, the aggressive, shock-attacking version found on shorelines. That's not a separate species. It's the same animal in a different stage of its life cycle. For about 1 year, a Drew goes through a transformation called Carvinassim and comes out onto land as what's called a land Drew, or a billy, to breed. With a hardened carapace and a much more aggressive temperament than the mild-mannered scavenger, it is the rest of the time in the water. After that year is up, it goes through another process called meth, sheds its unneeded skin and organs, and returns to the sea. The two forms look and act so differently that some scholars have argued the land Drew must be a separate, more primitive relative rather than the same creature, but the documented life cycle says otherwise. Almost everything a Drew is hunted for comes from that biology. Their wax, scraped from their shells, gets used in alchemy and to make candles, boot polish, and bottle stoppers, and it's also worked into traditional Dunmer armor and used to treat netch leather to keep it battle ready. Their claws get turned into knives and candle holders. Their shells yield a dark red pigment used for dye and lip stain, and even their waste has a use, mixed with mushrooms to make a repellent that keeps other drow away from fishing grounds. An entire supposed empire reduced over the ages to a source of wax and dye. East of Tamriel there is a continent called Akavir, Dragonland, and it's home to 4 nations, none of them human in the way Tamriel understands the word. The Kamal are described as snow demons who freeze solid over winter and thaw out to attack their neighbors every summer. The Kapotun are tiger dragons, ruled by a leader named Toshraka, who's said to have physically transformed himself into an actual dragon, the first of his people to manage it. The Tangmo are a monkey folk nation, generous and a little unhinged by reputation, who've successfully fought off enslavement attempts from every other Akaviri nation at one point or another. And the Tsaiski are serpent folk, sometimes described as a race of men, sometimes as beast folk, with some individuals indistinguishable from ordinary humans and a real possibility that they're shapeshifters, which makes even their own classification hard to pin down. The Tsashi carry the darkest reputation of the 4. One account holds that men actually did live in Akavir once, and that the Tsaiski ate every one of them, long enough ago that it's remembered as old history, not a current threat. Whether that's literally true or a folk explanation for why no human population survives on the continent, it sets the tone for how Tamriel has always talked about Akavir, as a place its own people got erased from. Tamriel's relationship with Akavir runs mostly through invasion in both directions, and the empire doesn't come out looking strong. In the First Era, 2703, Tsashi forces invaded and were beaten decisively at the Battle of Pale Pass by Riemann I. Riemann didn't just win and move on, though. He absorbed the surviving Akaviri into his own army, used their tactics and organization to help pacify the rest of Tamriel, and let them rise to real power inside his empire, a decision that eventually let an Akaviri named Versidushaye orchestrate the deaths of Riemann III and his heir, and take the imperial throne for himself as the first of the Akaviri potentates. A second Akaviri invasion in the Second Era, 572, landed Kamal forces in Skyrim, and though a combined Dunmer, Nord, and Argonian force eventually drove them into the sea, some survivors resurfaced in Cyrodiil generations later and briefly seized the Ruby Throne. The one time Tamriel actually tried to strike back on Akaviri soil, it went badly. In the Third Era, 288, Uriel Septim V spent 20 years preparing an invasion, launched it, and managed to capture 2 cities. 2 years later, at the Battle of Ionith, the whole campaign fell apart. Since then, contact between the 2 continents has been close to non-existent. Even the Nerevarine reportedly set out on an expedition to Akavir at some point and was never heard from again. Every recorded clash between Tamriel and Akavir, no matter which side started it, ends the same way, badly for whoever crossed the water. An Elder Scroll isn't a book, and it doesn't behave like one. Nobody can even say how many exist, because the lore is explicit that they do not exist in countable form. They can appear and disappear from place to place with no discernible pattern. And attempts by imperial librarians to take a full inventory have always failed for that exact reason. They're described as fragments of creation from outside time and space, things with no author, gods built, indestructible, sometimes small enough to hold in 2 hands, and sometimes, according to at least one account, large enough that the metal core of the adamantine tower itself is really a container for one massive scroll. Reading one is dangerous in a very literal sense. Someone with no idea what they're looking at can flip through an Elder Scroll and feel nothing unusual. But anyone who understands what they're holding and reads it without preparation will lose their sight or their sanity, sometimes both, in exchange for a glimpse of the scroll's contents. whether that's a piece of the future, the past, or the nature of reality itself. That's exactly why the job of storing and reading Elder Scrolls has traditionally belonged to one specific group, the cult of the Ancestor Moth. Their method depends on an actual living creature, a rare moth native to Cyrodiil that the cult believes carries Phuairons, fragments of the loving spirits of the dead, inside it. By keeping the moths close during a ritual called the Ritual of the Ancestor Moth, a trained moth priest can use the moth's song as a kind of buffer, dampening the scroll's effect on their mind enough to survive the reading. It still isn't free. Every reading blinds a moth priest temporarily, dark spots creeping into their vision that scholars call lepicalcos, and the blindness gets longer with every reading until eventually it doesn't lift at all. Some within the cult believe that going blind for good isn't inevitable, and that priests who wait months between readings and don't rush the process can keep their sight for decades. But permanent blindness is still the well-known cost of the job, not a rare accident. The moths themselves aren't just tools, either. Their silk, harvested from Cyrodiil's Nibinai region, gets spun into a crimson cloth called Ancestor Silk, embroidered with a reader's genealogy and enchanted to hold real power, and some of the cult's higher-ranking monks skip the enchantment ritual entirely and simply wear the moths on their bodies instead. The strangest part of an Elder Scroll isn't the blindness, it's what the scroll actually contains, because that isn't fixed. If the knowledge inside concerns the future, the contents can change from one reading to the next and from one reader to another, staying hazy and uncertain right up until the prophecy actually happens in the real world. Only once the events described come to pass does the scroll's content lock into place, identical for everyone who reads it after that. That means the same physical scroll can tell two different moth priests, two different stories, both true at the time each of them read it, and it also means a person who fulfills a scroll's prophecy is, in a real sense, the one who finally writes down what that scroll says. A handful of individuals, including certain Dragonborn, have managed to read a scroll and walk away with their sight and mind intact, despite having no training and knowing exactly what they were risking. And nobody in the lore has a solid explanation for why. The best guess offered is that the scrolls themselves choose, on occasion, to let certain readers through unharmed. Soul gems trap the souls of the dying at the moment of death. The games treat this mostly as a resource, something to fuel enchantments or recharge a weapon. The lore is more specific about what that actually costs. Soul gems themselves trace back to Molag Bal, who used a portion of his own power in creating them, and black soul gems specifically come from deep within Coldharbour, his own realm, where he personally fine-tunes them to work more efficiently. Ordinary soul trapping only works on what the lore calls white souls, the souls of animals and lesser creatures. Sapient beings, people, have black souls, and by the early rules of the Mages Guild, trapping a black soul was treated completely differently from trapping a white one. That division wasn't a natural law of magic. It was a deliberate policy put in place at the urging of Vanus Galerion specifically to limit how far soul trapping could go, since ordinary spells and standard gems were built to only take white souls at all. Black soul gems bypass that limit entirely, which is exactly why they're treated as dangerous, and why necromancers, not ordinary mages, are the ones who chase them down. The reason it matters whether a soul is trapped in white form or black comes down to what happens to it afterward. When a mortal soul gets used through a black soul gem, it's sent to a realm called the Soul Cairn, and it stays there for all eternity, rather than reaching whatever afterlife it was actually meant for. That's the real cost of the practice. A life ended and an afterlife permanently denied on top of it. The ideal masters, the rulers of the Soul Cairn, deal in exactly this kind of trade, offering necromancers power or armies of the undead in exchange for a steady supply of trapped souls to keep for themselves. Soul gems come in a range of sizes, from minor and petty up through common, greater, and grand, each one able to hold a bigger soul than the last, and a handful of named artifacts, like the Amulet of Kings and the Azura's Star, are powerful enough to be described as capable of holding something as vast as a divine soul. Mani Marco once considered the Amulet of Kings the most powerful soul gem ever made for exactly that reason, and tried to use it to trap the essence of Molag Bal himself as part of a plan to make himself a god, before he was stopped. Ebony gets treated in the games as just another crafting material, one tier below Daedric. In the lore, it's something much stranger, God's blood, the crystallized blood of Lorkhan, the god the Nords call Shor. According to legend, after Lorkhan was defeated in the Dawn era, Auriel couldn't destroy his heart outright, so he lashed it to an arrow and shot it clear across Tamriel and out into the sea. The blood that poured from the wound as it flew is what became ebony, a black, glass-like substance that's since turned up buried in volcanic regions all over Tamriel, most famously under the lava flows of Red Mountain in Vardenfell. This isn't just a poetic backstory that scholars quote and move on from. There's an actual town in Skyrim called Shor's Stone, named directly after the god, built around an ebony mine, and the miners who work there aren't shy about what they're digging up. They call it exactly what the legend says it is, the blood of Shor. It's such an ordinary part of Nordic speech that Shor's blood is a common exclamation of surprise across Skyrim, with Bretons using a slightly different version, Shior's blood, for the same purpose. Some Nords go a step further and claim that Nirncrux, a different substance found in places like Solstheim and Craglorn, is also Shor's blood, just under another name. Almost every culture that works ebony treats it as sacred in some way. Orc followers of the Trinimac cult use it in their armor and weapons specifically as a token of Lorkhan's blood, tied to the story of Trinimac tearing out Lorkhan's heart. Ysgramor is said to have cried literal tears of pure ebony while watching Sarthal burn. His son supposedly collected them to forge the legendary battle axe Uhtred. Raymond Ebonarm, the god of war, is depicted with an ebony sword fused into his arm and never without a full suit of ebony armor. None of that reads like ordinary metal. It reads like a substance everyone involved knows used to be inside a god. Then there's the part almost nobody who plays these games actually knows. Glass armor, the green crystalline gear that shows up as a step above ebony in several games, has nothing to do with window glass at all. It's made from malachite, a real, rare green mineral that forms from volcanic activity, and the name glass is just the informal term people in Tamriel use for it. Two of the most iconic materials in the games, one called God's Blood and one called Glass, both turn out to be volcanic minerals with names that hide what they actually are. Every rune scratched into a Daedric rune, every glowing symbol on a sigil or an enchanted weapon in the games comes from an actual working alphabet, not decoration. The Daedric alphabet is a direct substitute for the ordinary Latin alphabet used to write English. Every letter has a matching Daedric symbol, one for one, so any word can be written straight across from one script into the other. In world, both the Daedra and the Dunmer use it, and most scholars connect the Dunmer's use of it back to the era when the Chimer worshipped Daedra, before the Battle of Red Mountain changed everything about them. Two letters, Zaya and Yakim, standing in for X and Y, get left out of most formal writing, but still turn up on banners, weapons, and the occasional piece of enchanted clothing, which is why sharp-eyed players have spotted things like the grey cowl of Nocturnal spelling out a phrase in Daedric letters across its hood. Underneath that alphabet sits an actual language, and it's a much older one than Daedric script itself. Elnofex was spoken by the Elnofey, the beings who existed before Mundus was even created, back when they lived on one of the 12 worlds of creation in the earliest days of the Dawn era. It's described as an unusually dangerous language, one where the written characters distort if you look at them too long. Once it reached Nirn, Elnofex got passed down and slowly evolved into Aldmeris, the ancestor tongue of every Elvish language spoken today. It didn't stop with the elves either. Elnofex influenced Atmoran, the language of the earliest human migrants from the north, which is part of why Atmoran and Aldmeris ended up sharing certain words, including the word Talos, and Atmoran in turn fed into the languages that became Nordic and the rest of the human tongues of Tamriel. The Aelids held on to Elnofex and its old magic longer than most, preserving runes and Dawn-era knowledge that other elves had already started to forget by the time they split off from the Altmer, though even their careful preservation eventually drifted into its own separate language, Aeledum. By the 4th era, Elnofex itself was considered a dead language, studied by scholars but spoken by nobody, sitting quietly underneath nearly every word anyone in Tamriel actually says out loud. The Thu'um looks like a magic power in the games. Press a button, shout, something happens. Underneath that, it's really just speech, the dragon language used with intent. A single shout is built from 1 to 3 single-syllable words. Every one of those words is a real concept in the language, not a magic sound effect. Fusroda literally translates to force, balance, push. Yolturshul is fire, inferno, Sunday fame Zigron, the shout that turns a person into an intangible ghost-like form, translates to fade, spirit, bind. More than 50 individual dragon words are known and translated across the various shouts and inscriptions found on word walls, and the language itself has its own grammar, structurally close to English, with its own rules for plurals, possessives, and verb tense. Dragons don't learn the Thu'um the way a Nord tongue has to. For dragons, it's inherent. They're described as making no distinction at all between debating and fighting, because their words have always carried power for those who understand them. A dragon doesn't cast a spell by speaking a shout. Speaking is already the act, the same way breathing is already breathing. That's part of why dragons and dragonborn are described as fragments of Akatosh's soul, tied to the flow of time itself. The language isn't something layered on top of what a dragon is. It's part of what a dragon is. For Nords, the Thu'um works differently and has to be taught. Legend holds that Kain breathed onto the land at the throat of the world to give the earliest men their voice, and that the ancient dragon Paarthurnax later taught the actual Thu'um to the humans who would go on to rebel against the dragon cult, becoming the first tongues. It takes real talent and years of dedicated training for a human to become a genuine tongue, and the strongest ones have to be careful even in ordinary conversation, since a slip of the voice can do real damage. After a Nord army lost badly at the Battle of Red Mountain, despite having tongues in its ranks, one of them, Jurgen Windcaller, spent 7 years meditating on why raw power hadn't been enough, and the philosophy he came up with that the Thu'um should only be used in true need, rather than as a routine weapon, became the foundation for the Greybeards, the monks who've spent centuries at High Hrothgar mostly staying silent on purpose. A dragonborn skips most of that. Absorbing a dragon's soul means absorbing its knowledge of the language along with it, learning in moments what takes an ordinary tongue a lifetime to earn. Before Skyrim had kings, it had priests, and before that, it had dragons who ruled as gods and didn't pretend otherwise. The Atmorans who settled Skyrim brought a tradition of animal worship with them: the hawk, the wolf, the snake, the moth, the owl, the whale, the bear, the fox, and above all, the dragon. Some scholars think this was worship of Akatosh wearing an older name, since dragons and the dragon god of time share more than a passing resemblance. Whatever the dragons were standing in for, they were comfortable ruling as living gods. and men built temples to honor and appease them. Dragon priests acted as go-betweens, running the population on the dragon's behalf, and their authority sat level with kings. Saying the word for dragon out loud was forbidden to ordinary people. Only the priests were allowed to speak it. Those priests were the ones who got the masks. The highest ranking among them were given magical masks made by the dragons themselves, each one bearing the same name as the priest who wore it, each one carrying enchantments that don't behave the way ordinary magic behaves. The masks are older than almost anything else still standing in Skyrim, and when their owners died, the masks were buried with them. At some point, probably late in the Merethic era, the arrangement turned uglier. From their capital at Bromjunar, in what's now Yalmarch, the cult stopped merely ruling and started enslaving the people under it. Nobody agrees on what caused the shift. Some blame one particular dragon. Some blame a run of weak kings who let the priests take more than they should have. Some blame an ambitious priest who saw an opening and took it. The record doesn't settle the question, and the people telling the story now are separated from it by thousands of years, so it stays a guess. What isn't a guess is that the men rebelled, and the fight that followed became known as the Dragon War. It didn't stay a war of men against dragons for long. Some dragons broke with their own kind partway through and started teaching men their language directly, which is a second account of where the Thu'um came from, sitting next to the story of Cain breathing it into the Nords at the dawn of the world. Both versions get told. Nobody has made much effort to reconcile them. With that help, the rebels turned the war, and it ended with Alduin himself driven off. The priests were overthrown, and the dragons that survived scattered to remote corners of Tamriel. The cult that had run Skyrim for generations lost its gods in a single campaign. It didn't disappear right away. For centuries afterward, whenever the cult's remnants could get their hands on a dead dragon's remains, they built a mound over it, the same way they always had, on the belief that the dragons would rise again and reward whoever had stayed faithful. When priests of the Eight Divines showed up in Skyrim during the First Era looking for converts, they ran into a strange problem. The Nords had already dropped dragon worship after the war, so the only dragon-adjacent god they recognized was Auriel, the elven name for Akatosh, and they despised him as a demon of the people who'd nearly wiped them out. The missionaries got around this by arguing that Alduin and the dragons loyal to him had acted against Akatosh's own wishes, and that it was Akatosh who'd pushed the renegade dragons to help men in the first place. It worked well enough to get the Divines a foothold. The last organized holdouts of the dragon cult were tracked to the monastery of Forelhost, high in the mountains of the Rift, where High King Harold's forces besieged them until the survivors killed themselves rather than surrender. That was in the First Era, 140. After that, what was left of the cult wasn't a religion anymore, just Draugr, sealed into old temples across Skyrim, Solstheim, and parts of Hrothgar, guarding vault doors that only open for a key shaped like a dragon's claw. They stayed that way, undisturbed, for most of recorded history. It took the dragons actually coming back in the Fourth Era, 201, to wake the priests up again and put the masks back in motion. The word werewolf gets used for the whole category, but the werewolf is just the most common strain of a condition that comes in several forms, most of them tied to a particular region and a particular animal. Werebears turn up across Skyrim and Solstheim, common enough that people there rub canis root on their fences and trees specifically to keep them off the property. Wereboars, werecrocodiles, werevultures, and werelions are all recorded strains as well, each one following the same basic disease with a different animal attached to it, usually wherever that particular shape of Hircine's worship has taken hold. The werewolf strain is the only one common enough to occur across the whole continent rather than staying penned into one corner of it. The condition itself goes back to the Daedric prince Hircine, who is credited with creating it and handing it out as a blessing to devotees and great hunters, which is why it's called Hircine's gift by people who see it that way, and Hircine's curse by people who don't. The story his faithful tell is that he took the cunning of the first hunters who worshipped him and fused it with the strength and shape of beasts as a reward. Those first few, called the First Turned, passed the gift down to their own chosen followers. It spread out from there across Tamriel over the centuries that followed. However someone gets a particular strain, it spreads afterward the way a disease spreads. Canis lupinus, the strain that produces werewolves, moves through wounds from claws or teeth, and left untreated, it becomes full lycanthropy within days. The surest way to catch it is to drink an infected person's blood directly, which converts the drinker immediately, and the first transformation that follows is unusually intense. Once it takes hold, the changes aren't limited to the transformation itself. In beast form, the body's proportions shift, height increases, and the creature gains claws that can hurt things ordinary weapons can't touch. Outside of beast form, some of it lingers anyway. Bloodlust that doesn't fully go away, fitful sleep or none at all, faint traces of scent or fur that never quite disappear. Starve a lycanthrope long enough and it can turn feral, losing whatever control it had over the bloodlust in the first place. Silver weapons and certain poisons work especially well against them, and belladonna and wolfsbane are both toxic to a werewolf specifically, which is where most remedies for the disease start. A few lycanthropes fall outside the regional strain pattern entirely. The man-beast keeps a beast-like appearance even when not transformed, covered in fur with orange eyes, and stays sharper and less primal than a fully changed werewolf, capable of casting spells and using weapons while it waits in the shadows for prey. A werewolf lord keeps more of its original racial features even mid-transformation, blending them with wolf traits instead of erasing them outright, and can still speak and use magicka in that state. Some of the strongest ones live for centuries and can bend other werewolves to their will. A werewolf behemoth is simply bigger and stronger than an ordinary werewolf, a state reached either through alchemical alteration or as a direct gift from Hircine to a hunter he particularly favors. Curing any of it has to happen before the first transformation, since after that point a cure becomes extremely difficult to get. The Glenmoriel witches are known to hold genuine cures, potions, and rituals mostly free of side effects. They guard the knowledge closely and don't hand it out though. One of their rituals involves sacrificing an innocent, infecting the corpse with the client's curse, resurrecting it, and having the original lycanthrope kill it a second time, which is said to permanently destroy the inner beast. Another method uses magic drawn from the severed head of a Glenmoriel witch to summon the inner beast as a spirit and then destroy that spirit directly. Vampirism can also replace lycanthropy outright. A pure-blooded vampire can convert a lycanthrope straight into a vampire lord, swapping Hircine's gift for Molag Bal's in an instant. When a lycanthrope dies, the expectation is Hircine's hunting grounds instead of whatever afterlife they would otherwise have earned, a realm of dense woodland and grassland cut through with blood-red rivers, where any mortal who wanders in gets hunted down by what lives there. Werebears do the hunting during the day, and at night Hircine announces himself with a pack of werewolves at his side. Some lycanthropes consider this an ideal ending, and others feel cheated out of a real paradise. It also isn't automatic. One priest of the cult of the ancestor moth, writing during the interregnum, called the idea of Hircine simply claiming every lycanthrope's soul poetic and misleading, arguing that mortals choose their own soul's destination through how they live, not through what disease happens to be in their blood. There are recorded cases of lycanthropes ending up elsewhere entirely, including werewolves bound by a pact with Molag Bal, who went to Cold Harbor instead of the hunting grounds when they died. Vampirism traces back to Molag Bal raping a Nedic priestess of Arkai named Lamai Biolfug in the wilds of Skyrim and leaving a single drop of his own blood on her forehead before vanishing, and from that one act came every vampire on Tamriel, though what they became afterward split into more directions than almost anyone expects. Lamai herself rose from her own funeral pyre, killed the nomads who'd been caring for her, and became the first vampire, carrying a strain called Noxiphilic sanguivoria that doesn't burn in sunlight and actually grows stronger once night falls. Most other vampires aren't that lucky. The two more common diseases, sanguinare vampiris and porphyric hemophilia, both weaken their carriers in daylight and both come with a 3-day window in which the infection can still be cured like any ordinary illness. After that window closes, curing it gets much harder. Where a vampire falls on the family tree matters as much as which disease they're carrying. A pure-blooded vampire is one Molag Bal turned directly, and purebloods are stronger than anyone they go on to turn themselves, with female purebloods carrying the title Daughters of Cold Harbor. Some pure-blooded lines can produce vampire lords, a monstrous late-stage shape-shifted form that isn't available to ordinary vampires no matter how old they get. The Volkihar of Skyrim have this gift, and so do several vampires tied to the Grey Host. Lamai's own bloodline produces something else again, called Blood Scions, made through a ritual called the Rite of the Scion, in which an initiate's blood gets fully replaced with Lamai's own, turning them into something built to rival a vampire lord in strength. None of that happens by accident either. A vampire named Lady Esenia figured out how to build a new strain from scratch called Chaotica vampiris by blending several bloodlines together with a substance called azure plasm. It only infects people who are already vampires, and it produces blood knights, larger and faster than an ordinary vampire and worse at controlling their own instincts. Then there are blood fiends, which aren't really a bloodline at all so much as what happens to any vampire that starves for too long and loses its mind along with its self-control. Geography splits the picture even further. The Volkihar live under the frozen lakes of eastern Skyrim and can freeze victims with their breath. The vampires of Cyrodiil call themselves the Order, pass for ordinary people when well fed, and follow Molag Bal alongside Clavicus Vile, whom they credit for their ability to blend in. Blackmarsh has the Wet Fang, who keep victims alive in magical comas and drain them at leisure, and the Vaka Shuksalt, who worship Sithis from a temple called the Teeth of Sithis. Elsewhere has at least 2 clans of its own, the Hollowfang, who worship the Khajiit blood god Sangin, and the Tenar Zalvid, an ancient order that used to watch over the Khajiit dead in exchange for blood offerings before a plague and a raid by necromancers wiped most of them out. The Iliac Bay region alone hosts 9 separate named bloodlines, each with its own abilities and its own territory, most of them sharing one weakness: kill the Bloodfather at the root of a given line, and the whole line can be cured at once, sometimes dying of old age on the spot. Morrowind, where the Tribunal Temple spent centuries hunting vampires nearly to extinction, still has 3 native clans on Vardenfell alone: the Quara, aggressive hunters, the Burn, who prefer stealth, and the Aunde, mage vampires who hypnotize their prey rather than chase it. Older Morrowind clans go further still, like the Korgari, who fear nothing but water and the strongest weapons and can turn themselves into living flame, or the Diodata, who can see through the eyes of other vampires and hide from the Korgarion Islands the Fire Clan can't cross. Valenwood has the Bonsamu, who pass for ordinary Bosmer except by candlelight, the Yekev, who swallow victims whole, the Telboth, who murder entire families after replacing a child in it, and the Kirilf, who don't feed on people at all, and instead drink blood already collected by Horvers. Vampires have been recorded in Somerset, going back to the Direni era in the Merethic era, though little detail survives about what strain they carry. Cures are just as scattered as the bloodlines are. Falion, a wizard who lived in Morthal, could cure vampirism with a ritual built around a filled black soul gem, though little else about the process is recorded. A group of witches in the Iliac Bay brewed a potion out of garlic, bloodgrass, nightshade, Argonian blood, and the ashes of a powerful vampire, and used it to cure a nobleman's wife, though the process killed her the moment it worked. Troll fat is reputed to cure it as well, and so is a bath in something called purge blood salts. A less appealing option is trading one curse for another. The Blessing of Hircine can replace vampire blood with lycanthrope blood outright, though that swap comes with its own set of complications and doesn't leave anyone free of a curse, just carrying a different one. Moon sugar is a grainy white powder, refined from cane grasses native to the coasts and estuaries of Elsewhere, with a faint silver sheen that seems to glow when light catches it. In Elsewhere, it's a spice, folded into almost every dish, and unwarned visitors are cautioned against eating too freely, since the substance has mild narcotic and magical properties on top of its flavor. Humans and mare feel those effects far more strongly than Khajiit do. A short euphoric high gives way to days of exhaustion in outsiders, while Khajiit, who eat some form of it daily, build up enough tolerance that they mostly just get the good part, though even they can overdo it and end up dependent. To the Khajiit, moon sugar isn't just food, it's the holiest substance they have, spoken of the way other cultures speak of the soul. According to Khajiiti belief, it's crystallized moonlight caught in the waters of the Topal Sea and carried to the cane groves by the pool of the twin tides, and eating it is understood as consuming a small piece of the moon's own eternal souls. That belief traces back to the Khajiit creation story itself, where the goddess Azura, having already created the Khajiit and bound them to the lunar lattice with her mother Fadomai's first two secrets, spoke a third secret that sent moonlight down onto the marshes and turned it into moon sugar. Streets in Elsewhere's major cities regularly fill with Khajiit caught up in what's described as a kind of sugar fit, a religious ecstasy brought on by the substance doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Sheogorath and his Auriel are blamed for tempting people into taking that reverence too far, pushing moon sugar use from communion into overconsumption. Refine moon sugar further and it becomes skooma, a much harder and more addictive drug, smoked through a water pipe or drunk as a liquid. Sustained use leaves users with permanent confusion, mental decline, and lost teeth, and withdrawal alone can turn violent regardless of how pure the batch was. Quality varies a lot, and cheap skooma made from spoiled or moldy moon sugar, being far easier to obtain, is common and considerably more dangerous, sometimes fatal. Among the Khajiit, Sheogorath is known as the skooma cat, since some stories hold that skooma itself is the medium he speaks through, guarded by the same lunar lattice that moon sugar is tied to, which means using it carries a real risk of catching the mad god's attention. Certain Khajiit ceremonies use it deliberately and under strict control by religious officials called moon bishops, who treat the visions it produces as messages from the twin moons rather than as an ordinary high. Both moon sugar and skooma are illegal across most of the empire and much of the Aldmeri Dominion, which has never stopped either one from moving. Smuggling routes run through Morrowind and beyond it, sometimes using Khajiit themselves as the transport, and some Khajiit have grown wealthy running the trade through ports like Senchal. Regional variants have developed on top of the base product, including Balmora Blue, a heavily cut and more potent strain that got even more valuable on the black market after the city of Balmora was destroyed, and Redwater Skooma, a 4th era strain refined with water from a specific blood spring in Skyrim and used by vampires to keep skooma addicts hooked and available as a blood source. There are 17 Daedric princes, generally known to mortals, each ruling a sphere, each holding a plane of oblivion shaped by their own will, and most of them keep a specific calendar date on which contact runs easier than usual, along with one signature artifact tied closely enough to their name that finding the item and finding the prince tend to be the same quest. Azura, whose sphere is dawn and dusk, fate and prophecy, is contacted most easily on Hogithum, the 21st of First Seed, and her artifact is Azura's Star, a soul gem that can be used again and again without ever shattering. Boethia, whose sphere covers plots, betrayal, and the violent overthrow of authority, has a summoning day called Gauntlet on the 2nd of Sun's Dusk, and is tied to the Ebony Mail, an armor enchanted to poison anyone who gets close to its wearer. Clavicus Vile, whose sphere is bargains and granted wishes, keeps his day on the New Life Festival, the 1st of Morning Star, and is rarely mentioned without his companion Barbas and his own signature item, the Mask of Clavicus Vila. Hermaius Mora, whose sphere is forbidden knowledge, can be reached on the 5th of First Seed, and his signature artifact is the Ogma Infinium, a book that rewrites the reader's own capabilities depending on which path through it they choose. Hircine, Prince of the Hunt and Father of Lycanthropy, keeps the 5th of Midyear as his day, and his artifact, Savior's Hide, is made from the pelt of a beast he considers a worthy hunt in its own right. Yigalag, Prince of Order, doesn't keep a summoning day the way the others do, since the being mortals could once petition directly was cursed into becoming Sheogorath long ago, and the two, though connected, aren't approached as the same prince anymore. Malakath, patron of the spurned and oath-broken, is summoned on the 8th of Frostfall, traditionally with troll fat as part of the ritual, and his weapon, Volendrung, is heavy enough that Sheogorath himself has called it a true Daedric artifact, despite Malakath's uneasy standing among his own siblings. Myrun's Dagon, whose sphere is destruction and violent change, keeps the Warriors' Festival, the 20th of Sun's Dusk, and his artifact, Myrun's Razor, carries a chance of killing outright with a single cut, regardless of how much the target could otherwise withstand. Mephala, the Web Spinner, whose sphere touches murder, secrets, and manipulation, is contacted during the Witches' Festival on the 13th of Frostfall, and her artifact is the Ebony Blade, a sword that grows stronger the more it's used to betray the people closest to its wielder. Meridia, Lady of Life and Light, hostile to the undead above almost anything else, keeps the 13th of Morning Star, and her artifact, Dawnbreaker, sets undead enemies ablaze on contact. Molag Bal, whose sphere is domination and the enslavement of mortals, and who fathered vampirism through Lamaebal, is summoned during Chila, the 20th of Evening Star, and his weapon, the Mace of Molag Bal, drains an enemy's magic with every strike, which is also why it's sometimes called the Vampire's Mace. Namira, Prince of Ancient Darkness, Decay, and the things mortals instinctively recoil from, keeps Maruk's Day, the 9th of Second Seed, and her artifact is the Ring of Namira, which rewards particularly grim behavior toward the dead with power over the living. Nocturnal, Prince of Night, Shadow, and Mystery, some of whose followers consider her the oldest and most powerful prince of all, keeps the 3rd of Hearthfire, and her signature item is the Skeleton Key, capable of opening any lock and never breaking in the process. Periate, the Taskmaster, whose sphere covers pestilence and the lowest orders of oblivion, is generally reckoned one of the weaker princes and is tied to the artifact Spellbreaker, a shield that reflects hostile spells back at whoever cast them. Sanguine, Lord of Revelry and Excess, keeps Heart's Day, the 16th of Sun's Dawn, and his artifact, the Sanguine Rose, summons a Daedra to fight briefly on the wielder's behalf, in keeping with a prince who's more interested in a good party than in outright cruelty. Sheogorath, Prince of Madness, and the being Jigalag becomes under an ancient curse, keeps mad Pelagia's day, the second of sun's dawn, though he's also known to answer a summons on another prince's day if a storm happens to be rolling through at the time, and his weapon is the Wabajak, a staff whose effects are never quite predictable twice in a row. Vermina, prince of dreams and nightmares, who feeds on mortal memories she pulls from sleepers, keeps the 10th of sun's height, coinciding with the merchant's festival, and her artifact is the Skull of Corruption, which can pull an enemy into a dream and strike them there instead of in the waking world. One more prince exists outside this list entirely. Itelia, the Prince of Paths, was erased from the memory of nearly everyone in existence by Hermaeus Mora, acting alongside Azura, Boeotia, and Mephala, who judged her power over fate too dangerous to be allowed to remain known. She has no summoning day recorded anywhere, because as far as most of Tamriel is concerned, she was never there to begin with. A birth sign isn't a metaphor in Tamriel, it's a constellation, an actual arrangement of stars that sits overhead during a specific month. And the one in the sky when a person is born is believed to shape that person's character and fate for the rest of their life. There are 13 recognized constellations, sometimes called the 13 patrons. 12 of them pair off into 3 groups of 4, each group led by a guardian constellation. Reach folk call them the Reach Guardians, with 3 lesser constellations under it, known as its charges, and each of the 12 corresponds to 1 month of the year. The warrior guards the lady, the steed, and the lord, and people born under the warrior are thought to run short-tempered and skilled with weapons, while those under its charges are said to come out kind and tolerant under the lady, restless and always in a hurry under the steed, and strong and healthy but oddly vulnerable to fire under the lord. The mage guards the apprentice, the Atronak, and the ritual, and being born under the mage itself is supposed to bring more magicka and a talent for spellcasting, alongside a reputation for arrogance, while the apprentice grants an affinity for magic paired with a vulnerability to it. The Atronach grants deep reserves of magicka without the ability to replenish them, and the ritual's effects are said to shift depending on where the moons and planets happen to sit at the time. The thief guards the lover, the shadow, and the tower, and its own children are supposed to take risks and dodge harm right up until their luck runs out and cuts their lives short. While the lover brings grace and passion, the shadow brings a knack for hiding, and the tower brings an unusual gift for finding gold and opening locks. The 13th sign, the serpent, doesn't belong to any of the 3 groups and doesn't sit in the sky during a fixed month the way the others do. It's made of 4 so-called unstars rather than ordinary stars, and instead of holding still, it drifts across the sky in a path that's genuinely hard to predict, sometimes flatly impossible. Nobody credits people born under the serpent with any shared trait except an extreme one. They're said to be simultaneously the most blessed and the most cursed of anyone in Tamriel, with nothing in between. Different peoples read the same sky differently. The Reach folk call constellations skytails and believe the 3 guardians actively work together to protect their charges from a malevolent pattern they call the snake in the stars. The Dwemer built orreries and observatories specifically to track them, with a particular fascination for the serpent, and gave each constellation its own name in Dwemeris, calling the warrior the headsman and the mage the mechanist, among others. Yokudans held that the stars guided a person's path from birth through death and beyond, and their songs and poetry returned to that idea constantly. Around the Second Era, 578, the 3 guardian signs themselves are said to have fallen out of the sky and taken on mortal form as beings known as celestials, a rare case of the pattern overhead actually walking around on Nirn. The Sijic Order was already old by the time anyone thought to write about it. It was founded during the earliest Aldmer settlement of Somerset Isle, when a group of dissident elders rejected a change taking hold in Aldmeri religion, a shift away from honoring all ancestors and toward honoring only the ancestors claimed by the ruling elite, the ones who'd go on to become Auriel, Trinimac, Sirabane, and Finaster in the Standard Pantheon. Those dissidents left for the nearby island of Artium to keep practicing what they called the old ways on their own terms, and by the time a Breton sage named Vornet traveled there to study with them in the First Era, 20, the order was already established enough to have a rite master, a body of ritual, and centuries behind it. Under the old ways, both Aedra and Daedra get treated as nothing more than exceptionally powerful ancestor spirits rather than gods in any absolute sense, and the order gives wisdom more weight than godhood or raw magical strength. Necromancy is the one practice they flatly prohibit, on the grounds that it's both dangerous and heretical. Artaeum itself doesn't stay in one place. The Sijics can move the island at will, render it insubstantial, or make it vanish from Nirn's reality altogether, and the disappearances that follow, sometimes lasting centuries, are generally read as the order withdrawing from the world whenever history gets too chaotic for their taste. It's said that even the Daedric princes don't know where Artaeum sits when it's gone. Vanus Galerion trained there as a young man, alongside a fellow student named Manimarco, and the two built a friendship out of rivalry, debating magical theory in front of other students who gathered to listen. That friendship ended when Galerion discovered Manimarco had been running necromantic experiments in the traitor's vault. Disgusted, Galerion confronted him directly, begged him to stop, and when that failed, reported him to Rite Master Iachisis. Manimarco was banished from the order and sent to the mainland, but banishment was the extent of it. He wasn't stopped, just relocated, and it was that half measure, paired with an order growing more isolationist by the year, its emissaries recalled, its mists thickening around Artaeum, that pushed Galerion to leave the Sijics entirely and found the Mages Guild in the Second Era, 230. It wasn't a welcome idea at the time. People called it Galerion's folly, and Galerion had to defend the plan personally in front of his own former mentor, Iachisis, along with King Release of Firsthold and other powerful figures, in what came to be known as the Charter Conclave. Whatever he said worked, the charter was approved, and Release effectively became a co-founder. The whole point of the guild, in contrast to the Sijic secrecy, was to take magic out of the hands of the aristocracy and the isolated covens that had guarded it and put it within reach of ordinary people who could pay for training. Artaeum vanished not long after Galerion's departure, and Galerion himself later guessed that the Sijics had realized their mistake in merely exiling Manimarco and pulled back from the world rather than face the consequences directly. Those consequences arrived anyway, and necromancy sat at the center of them for the rest of the guild's history. Early on, after a soul-trapping spell Galerion blamed on Manimarco became common knowledge among mages, Galerion drew a line between legal white souls, taken from beasts, and illegal black souls, taken from sentient mortals, and had the guild teach only the white soul version of the spell. That line held for a long time, until Manimarco maneuvered an Empress Regent into worshipping Molag Bal, used her to have the Mages Guild expelled from the Imperial City, and legalized necromancy without fanfare once his own worm cult had a free hand to operate in the guild's place. The ban came back later, in the Third Era, 431, when a newly elected archmage named Hannibal Traven simply started enforcing the rule that had technically been on the books since Galerion's founding. Half the Council of Mages resigned over it, Manimarco's forces retaliated by burning down the guild's hall in Bruma, and Traven ultimately sealed his own soul inside a colossal black soul gem to shield an ally from Manimarco's magic, dying to make the final confrontation with the King of Worms possible at all. The guild didn't survive much past that. It dissolved sometime before the Fourth Era, 48, leaving the Synod and the College of Whispers to inherit its role as Tamriel's recognized magical institutions. Artaeum, for its part, disappeared again around the turn of the 2nd century of the Fourth Era, its absence lining up with the Void Knights and a fresh wave of Aldmeri Dominion expansion, and nobody outside the Order has ever fully explained why it chose that particular moment to leave again. The Amulet of Kings is a soul gem. That's easy to lose sight of underneath all the ceremony surrounding it, but at its center sits the Kimel Adabal, the Red Diamond, an Aelid-made vessel said to hold Akatosh's own divine power. And what it actually stores is a bond. The Covenant Akatosh forged with Alessia as she lay dying, sealed with his blood, and passed down through her line ever since. Only someone carrying that same blood, a Dragonborn, could wear it and survive the attempt. What the requirement actually amounted to was debated even among scholars who studied it, some describing it as literal bloodline and others as something more like a divine mandate tied to the qualities of a ruler. But in practice, it meant the amulet simply refused to work for anyone outside a very narrow line of succession. Every emperor who wore it during coronation had their soul enshrined in the central stone alongside all the emperors before them, forming what was called an oversoul, a kind of standing council of the dead that could be consulted by their successors and that reportedly knew things not even the Elder Scrolls could speak to, including what happened during a dragon break. The mechanism that mattered most, though, wasn't the coronation pageantry, it was the dragon fires. Lighting them was the entire point of putting the amulet on in the first place. A ritual performed in the Temple of the One, but drawing its actual source from the Sublime Brazier, a cauldron buried in a cathedral deep under the imperial sewers, said to reach down to the very heart of Nirn. Once lit, the dragon fire stayed burning for the length of that emperor's reign, and what they were actually doing the entire time was holding shut the barrier between Nirn and the Plains of Oblivion. Every ruling emperor was, functionally, a walking key that kept an unwanted door closed. The fires only went dark when the wearer died, and a new coronation was needed to relight them before the gap stayed open too long. That's the reason the Oblivion Crisis was possible at all in the Third Era, 433. The Mythic Dawn didn't need to defeat an empire or breach a magical ward built to withstand siege. They only had to kill every legitimate heir of Uriel Septim VII, which they very nearly managed. And the Dragonfires went out because there was no Dragonborn left standing who could relight them. With the barrier no longer held shut, stable Oblivion gates could open and stay open, each one weakening the wall between worlds a little further, the way cracks spread through a pane of glass under repeated pressure. Left unaddressed, the whole barrier would eventually have failed completely, joining Nirn and Oblivion together outright. The fix, in the end, wasn't a new coronation. Martin Septim, Uriel's illegitimate son and the last of the bloodline, had the amulet in hand when Meirunes Dagon's forces closed in on the Temple of the One, and rather than wear it, he smashed it. The blood of the Covenant, freed all at once, summoned Akatosh himself in the form of a fiery dragon, who fought and defeated Dagon while Martin's own body was consumed in the same act. The barrier that resulted was sealed permanently rather than renewed year to year the way the old system worked, strong enough that even a sigil stone, an object powerful enough to dissolve 1,000 soul gems just by being near them, could barely dent it. It also meant the mechanism that had protected Tamriel for nearly 4,000 years, one fragile human life at a time, was gone for good, replaced by something that no longer needed an amulet, a bloodline, or a coronation to keep working. Baron Zaya shows up across 4 different Elder Scrolls games spanning most of her life, from a princess orphaned in a sacked city to the Queen Mother of Morrowind, and the strange part is that the games themselves can't fully agree on what actually happened to her along the way. She was born to the rulers of Mournhold near the end of the Second Era, into the Ratim line of House Hlaalu, and her childhood ended the moment Tiber Septim's war reached her city and left it in ruins. What came next depends entirely on which account gets believed. The official version, an authorized biography written by imperial scribes, describes a well-behaved ward raised by a loving Skyrim count, tricked into running away at 16 by a stable boy who convinced her she was about to be sold into prostitution, and eventually reunited with the Septim family, who took her in and treated her as one of their own before she returned home to rule. A second book, called The Real Baron Zaya and claiming to be her own private confession, tells nearly the same sequence of events, with the polish stripped off: years of theft and promiscuity, a stint with the Thieves Guild in Riften, an affair with Tiber Septim himself that ended in a forced abortion, and a general willingness on Baron Zaya's part to lie about all of it once she had a throne to protect. A third account, published centuries later in the Fourth Era and called The Nightingales, disputes pieces of both, claiming the seducer who later stole the Staff of Chaos from her wasn't Jagar Tharn in disguise at all, but a separate master thief working for him, and that Baron Zaya kept the truth buried to protect her own reputation. All 3 books exist in the historical record. None of them fully agree, and no one, including people inside the story itself, ever manages to settle which version is accurate. Baron Zaya spent real political effort making sure the unflattering version stayed buried. She publicly called The Real Baron Zaya a cruel, defamatory work by a disgruntled and possibly deranged scribe, had it suppressed, and let it be known the author had been executed for writing it. That wasn't true. The actual author, a friend of hers who wrote under the name Platinius Mero, survived, and Baron Zaya protected him from the imperial family's retribution for years afterward, apparently because she recognized the account as true and found some private amusement in it rather than outrage. A censored version of the book eventually circulated anyway, with the sexual material trimmed out at the Tribunal Temple's request, but individual chapters of the original kept resurfacing regardless of how hard she worked to bury them. The staff at the center of that scandal had a long history before Baron Zaya ever touched it. It was forged around the First Era, 480, by an enchanter named Lorith the Fangleman, made from the essence of the land itself, nearly indestructible, and capable of both sowing strife wherever its bearer traveled and destroying enemies outright. An Akaviri prophecy carved into Alduin's wall centuries later foretold its splitting into 8 pieces during a period of misrule as the opening event leading toward the return of Alduin himself, a forecast that came true almost exactly during the Imperial Simulacrum. How the staff passed from Lorith's hands into Tiber Septim's is never explained. The only certainty is that Septim had it in his possession during his war on Morrowind and chose not to keep it, leaving it under guard in Mournhold in Symmachus's care rather than wielding it himself. It sat there undisturbed for generations, until the Third Era, 376, when Baron Zaya, seduced and manipulated by a bard who turned out to be either Jagar Tharn in disguise or a hired thief working on his behalf, unknowingly revealed its location and let it be stolen out from under her. That theft is what made the Imperial Simulacrum possible. Tharn used the staff to trap the real Uriel Septim VII inside a private plane of oblivion, where time crawled by so slowly that centuries would pass for him in what looked like moments outside, then killed the one witness who'd figured out what he'd done. Once his impersonation was secure, he drained the staff's power into an artifact called the Jewel of Fire, split the now useless staff into 8 pieces, and scattered them across the empire, banking on the fact that even if someone reassembled it, they'd find it powerless without the jewel. Someone did reassemble it anyway, tracked Tarn to the Imperial Palace, and used the drained staff to pull the power back out of the Jewel of Fire, which killed Tarn and freed the real Emperor. What happened to the staff in that final moment isn't fully settled either. The last anyone saw of it, it was dissolving into the gap it had just torn open, and whether it survived that or was destroyed along with the Jewel of Fire has never been confirmed one way or the other. The Fourth Era Thalmor described their own purpose in a specific phrase: the pacification and purification of all of Tamriel, to bring about a new Merethic era. That's their own stated language, not a summary someone else attached to them afterward, and it's worth taking literally. The Merethic era was the stretch of history before men arrived in Tamriel at all, when the continent belonged to elves alone. A goal framed that way isn't really about conquest in the ordinary sense of moving borders and collecting territory. It's about undoing the world as it currently exists, mortal races included, and remaking it into something closer to what it was before those races showed up. There have been 3 organizations called the Aldmeri Dominion, and each pursued some version of that same underlying idea, that elves are meant to hold dominance over Tamriel, even when their public justifications differed wildly. The Thalmor itself started small, as an obscure council inside the Somerset Isles government tasked with protecting Altmeri heritage. It only became something larger when Queen Iron built the first Aldmeri Dominion in the Second Era, 580, by folding Valenwood and elsewhere in through the Elden Accord, framed publicly as an alliance to help the Bosmer through a civil war and the Khajiit through a plague. But the Dominion's actual stated ambition was to usher in a new age of Elven rule specifically to protect Tamriel from what they called the reckless tendencies of the younger races, meaning men whose short lives they took as proof of poor judgment. That version dissolved before the interregnum ended. A second dominion rose out of a dynastic argument over Valenwood's throne, invading under the cover of an old treaty, and it lasted until Tiber Septim ended it in the Second Era, 896, using the Numidium. The third and current dominion is the one that matters now, and it built its legitimacy on a story rather than a conquest. After the Oblivion Crisis, the Thalmor, by then a marginal xenophobic faction, claimed credit for saving Somerset Isle during the chaos, and rode that claim to popularity and eventually total control of the Isles by the Fourth Era, 22. Their pattern of claiming credit for events they may or may not have actually caused shows up again a few decades later, when contact between the Dominion and the rest of Tamriel went silent for 70 years, and then abruptly resumed, with the Thalmor announcing they'd personally ended the Void Knights and brought the moons back over elsewhere. That claim was never independently confirmed. It didn't need to be, since the Khajiit believed it, and the goodwill it bought helped pull elsewhere further into the Dominion's orbit. The confirmed events are less ambiguous than the propaganda. In the Fourth Era, 171, the Thalmor delivered a set of ultimatums to the Imperial City, and when Emperor Titus Mede II refused them, presented the heads of every Blades agent stationed in the Dominion as their answer, starting the Great War outright. 4 years of fighting ended in the White Gold Concordat, which forced the Empire to cede southern Hammerfell, disband the Blades, and ban the worship of Talos across Imperial territory, with the Thalmor themselves given the right to enforce that ban. Talos worship stayed legal nowhere the Concordat reached, but it mattered most in Skyrim, where Nords had revered Talos as both a god and a national hero for centuries, and where the Thalmor's crackdown, run out of an embassy in Hafinger under a justiciar named Elenwen, became one of the direct causes of the Stormcloak Rebellion. Reports from that period describe Thalmor justiciars expressing open hostility toward Nords, some advocating outright for their extermination, and describe a faction inside the Dominion that officially backed the Empire in Skyrim's civil war, while privately working to keep the fighting going as long as possible, since a quick victory by either side would have hurt Dominion interests more than a long stalemate. What the Thalmor say their goal is, and what the Thalmor actually do on the ground, line up more often than not. The claims of causing the moon's return or single-handedly saving Somerset are unverifiable, self-serving stories with no independent confirmation behind them. The Great War, the Concordat, the persecution in Skyrim, and the stated ambition to purify Tamriel back into something resembling a world without men in it are not stories. Those are documented, and they point in the same direction as the language the Thalmor use about themselves. Morrowind's great houses started out as 6, not 5. When the Chimer split off from their Aldmeri kin and followed the prophet Veloth away from Somerset, they eventually organized themselves into political clans: Indoril, Redoran, Telvanni, Hlalu, Dresh, and Dagoth. For a while, House Dagoth sat on the Grand Council with the other 5, one of the founding clans that helped build the Library of Andule, a shared archive of the earliest Chimer genealogies. Then came the War of the First Council, fought between the Chimer and their old Dwemer allies over the Dwemer's secret attempt to build a mechanical god out of the heart of Lorkhan. Accounts disagree on which side House Dagoth actually fought for. Imperial sources describe Dagoth siding with the Dwemer against its own kin. The Ashlander tradition and the Tribunal Temple's own records say the opposite, that House Dagoth fought loyally alongside the other 5 houses and never betrayed anyone. What both versions agree on is the outcome. After the Battle of Red Mountain, House Dagoth was branded a traitor house regardless, and the other houses made sure of what came next. Every record of the house's existence was destroyed. Its members were killed or absorbed into the surviving houses. For roughly 2,000 years afterward, House Dagoth wasn't a historical footnote so much as a rumor, a name that survived mostly as superstition among ordinary Dunmer rather than as a documented fact. Its own former leader remembered, if at all, as a traitor who no longer had a house to be traitor to. It came back anyway. Warren Dagoth, the house's last lord, had survived the battle and its aftermath by binding himself to the heart of Lorkhan directly, spending centuries hidden inside Red Mountain while the rest of the world assumed he was gone. When he resurfaced at the end of the Second Era, he emerged as Dagoth-Ur, sustained by the heart's power, and no longer entirely mortal in the ordinary sense. He turned his remaining followers into ash vampires bound to the same power source, set out to finish the mechanical god the Dwemer had started building, and ambushed the Tribunal's own priesthood during their annual ritual to renew their divine power at the Heart Chamber, a single strike that permanently cut the Tribunal off from the full strength they'd relied on for centuries. From there, he spread the Blight, ash storms carrying a disease called Corprus that either reduced its victims to mindless husks or twisted them into ash creatures loyal to his cause. And for the next 400 years, the Tribunal Temple's forces tried and failed to dislodge him from Red Mountain. It took the arrival of the Nerevarine centuries later to finally end it, defeating Dagoth-Ur and destroying the source of his power for good. What's left of the old 6-house structure today isn't quite the same lineup either. Hlalu, once the dominant house under imperial rule, was stripped of its seat and scapegoated after the Argonian invasion that followed Red Mountain's eruption in the early 4th Era, and a previously minor house called Sadras took its place on the Grand Council instead. Indoril survives mostly folded into the modern Tribunal Temple's priesthood rather than as an independent political force. Redoran, Telvanni, and Dres remain standing in some form. Dagoth, the 6th house, is still gone, still erased from the council it once sat on, the one great house whose entire history exists only because its founder refused to die on schedule. The Legion a recruit joins during Skyrim's civil war belongs to the third empire Tamriel has had, and by that point in its history, it's also the weakest version that empire has ever been. The first was the Alessian Empire, founded in the First Era, 243 after Alessia led a slave rebellion against the Aelid Empire and received the Dragon Fires and the Amulet of Kings directly from Akatosh as a reward. It lasted more than 2,000 years, though it spent much of that time gripped by an increasingly fanatical religious movement called the Alessian Order, whose doctrine got formally adopted and enforced by the state itself in the First Era, 361, and whose leaders came to wield nearly as much power as the emperors they served. That religious grip eventually became the empire's undoing. Internal fighting inside the Order's own priesthood triggered the decade-long War of Righteousness, and the Alessian Empire finally broke apart in the First Era, 2331, leaving Tamriel divided into competing kingdoms for the next several hundred years. The Second Empire came out of the Akaviri invasion of the First Era, 2703, when Riemund Serodil united Serodil's fractured kingdoms to defeat the Tsaisci at Pale Pass, and then kept going, conquering everything on the continent except Morrowind, which held out for over a century longer through the Fourscore War before a truce was finally signed. That Second Empire actually has two distinct chapters folded into it. The first 2 centuries belonged to Riemund's own bloodline, ending when his last heir, Riemund III, was assassinated on the orders of his own chief advisor, an Akaviri official named Versidu Shaye. What followed was the Akaviri Potentate, which ran the Second Empire for roughly the next 430 years without a single emperor from Riemund's line on the throne. Under the Potentate, the Legion reached a level of control it's never matched since. Faced with widespread rebellion in the Second Era, 283, Versidu Shaye ordered every vassal lord in the empire to dissolve their own private armies, and after nearly 40 years of enforcing that order by force, the Imperial Legion had become the only army left standing in the entire empire. The Second Empire collapsed in the Second Era, 430, when the last potentate was assassinated, opening the chaotic stretch known as the Interregnum, during which the only thing calling itself an empire was a much smaller Cyrodiil-only state that notably was never ruled by a dragonborn at all. The third and final empire is the one most people picture when they hear the word. Tiber Septim declared it in the Second Era, 854, after fighting the decades-long Tiber War, and it's the only one of the 3 that ever managed to unite the entire continent under a single banner, a feat completed in the Second Era, 896, when the Numidium brought even the previously unconquered Somerset Isles under his control. That Third Empire lasted through the whole of the Third Era and roughly 2 centuries into the Fourth before its long decline set in. By the time Titus Mede II took the throne, the empire had already lost Valenwood and elsewhere to the Aldmeri Dominion, lost Black Marsh in the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis, and watched Morrowind fall out of Imperial hands after the eruption of Red Mountain, leaving only Cyrodiil, High Rock, and Skyrim as the provinces still holding steady, a state described plainly at the time as a shadow of its former glory. The Great War against the Thalmor and the White Gold Concordat that ended it cost the Empire Hammerfell as well, at least for a time, and left what remained even more diminished and unstable than before. That's the Empire whose Legion recruits soldiers in Skyrim, still technically the third and only empire ever to unify Tamriel, but standing at the weakest and most reduced point in its own 400-year history when the recruiting starts. The blades didn't start out Cyrodiilic, and the gear they carried never really stopped showing it. Every katana and every piece of ceremonial armor associated with the order traces directly back to Akavir, inherited whole from the Akaviri Dragon Guard the blades descended from, never replaced with anything Cyrodiilic even centuries into serving a Cyrodiilic empire. That connection goes back to the Akaviri invasion of the First Era, 2703, when a Taishi armada landed in the north and cut through Skyrim and Morrowind before Riemann Cyrodiil and the Dunmer god Vivek joined forces to stop it at Pale Pass. The Akaviri warriors on that expedition had reportedly been searching for a Dragonborn for a long time before they ever reached Tamriel, and when they heard Riemann's voice during the climactic fighting at Pale Pass, they recognized what it meant, knelt, and swore fealty to him on the spot. That surrender turned into the Dragon Guard, an order that became Riemann's personal bodyguard and went on to build Skyhaven Temple in the Reach specifically to support the continuing crusade against dragons. The same task the order had apparently been built around from the start. The Dragon Guard served the Riemann dynasty for the rest of its run, but when Riemann III was assassinated on the orders of his own chief advisor, the order disbanded in disgrace along with the dynasty it had protected. It didn't disappear entirely. A splinter faction refused to let the mission end there and set out across Tamriel searching for the next legitimate Dragonborn, a surge patient enough that some of its members turned to methods like vampirism just to extend their own lives long enough to see it through. Centuries passed before that search paid off. The splinter group eventually found its way into the service of King Culecain during his conquest of Cyrodiil, then transferred its loyalty to the general who would become Tiber Septim once they recognized him as the very Dragonborn they'd been hunting for generations. Under the Septim dynasty, the order took the name it's remembered by now and grew into something much larger than a bodyguard corps, developing into a continent-spanning intelligence service that answered directly to the Emperor. Blades agents spent the Third Era doing everything from reassembling the shattered Numidium to investigating the Nerevarine prophecies to escorting Uriel Septim VII's court through the Oblivion Crisis. And through all of that expansion, the Order's core identity and its equipment stayed unmistakably Akaviri. The katanas, the armor, the architecture of their strongholds, all of it can be traced straight back to the Dragon Guard rather than to anything native to Cyrodiil, even as the Blades became one of the most Cyrodiilic coded institutions in the entire Empire. The Order's second collapse mirrored its first. After the Great War, the White Gold Concordat formally disbanded the Blades and outlawed Talos worship in the same stroke, and the Thalmor used the opening to hunt Blades agents down across Tamriel, destroying centuries of archives at Cloud Ruler Temple and killing most of the Order's remaining members outright. The handful of survivors, people like Delphine, spent decades in hiding, avoiding contact even with each other to stay ahead of Thalmor surveillance. It took the return of actual dragons to Skyrim in the Fourth Era, 201, to bring any of them back into the open, and when they did resurface to work with the last Dragonborn, they didn't rebuild the intelligence network the Blades had spent centuries growing into. They reoccupied Skyhaven Temple and returned the Order to the one job it had been built around at Pale Pass nearly 2,000 years earlier, before it was the Blades at all, back when it was still just Akaviri warriors sworn to hunt dragons. The Empire's position on Talos is simple and official. Talos is Tiber Septim, one man, deified. That's the version stamped on the coinage, and the version the White Gold Concordat now bans the worship of outright on the Aldmeri Dominion stated grounds, that a man, singular, cannot become a true god. The Nord tradition tells a stranger story, one where Talos was never one man in the first place, but three, fused together by violence into a single throne. The official account starts with a general named Hjalti Earlybeard, born, depending on which record gets trusted, either in Atmora or on the island of Alcair in High Rock, serving under King Culcain of Falkreath during the chaos of the Interregnum. Hjalti shouted down the walls at the Battle of Old Hroldan, earned the name Talos, meaning Storm Crown, and after Culcain was assassinated, had himself crowned Emperor Tiber Septim instead. He went on to conquer the whole of Tamriel, ruled for 81 years, died in the Third Era, 38 at the age of 108, and ascended to become the ninth of the 9 divines. That's the whole story, as far as the Empire is concerned. One man's life, one man's death, one man's godhood. The Nord version keeps Hjalti but refuses to let him stand alone. According to the 5 songs of King Wulfharth and a text called the Arcturian Heresy, Hjalti's shout at Old Hroldan wasn't entirely his own. A storm cloud appeared beside him during that battle, shielded his men from arrows, and lent him its power, and that storm was Wulfharth, an ancient High King of Skyrim who'd already died and returned to life multiple times over the preceding centuries, once as the Ash King raised from ashes to fight at the Battle of Red Mountain, later as a being called the Underking. Wulfharth stayed at Hjalti's side through the entire conquest that followed, counseling him, protecting him, and pushing him toward one goal above all others: using the growing Empire's strength to finally crush the Tribunal of Morrowind, gods Wulfharth had hated since his own long-ago defeat at Red Mountain. That goal never happened, and the reason it didn't is what pulled the third man into the story. When Tiber Septim's empire reached Morrowind's border, the Tribunal offered an armistice instead of a war, handing over a Dwemer construct called Numidium in exchange for peace. Wulfharth took the armistice as a betrayal and abandoned the empire in disgust. Meanwhile, Tiber's imperial battle mage, Zurine Arctus, spent years trying to get the inert Numidium working, digging through incomplete Dwemer plans until he concluded the construct needed to be powered by the Heart of Lorkhan, which Arctus took to mean the literal life force of Lorkhan's mortal avatar on Nirn, Wulfharth himself. Tiber Septim, hearing this, saw a way to finish his conquest after all, and lied to lure Wulfharth back to the Imperial City, claiming he'd changed his mind about Morrowind. Wulfharth returned. Imperial guards were waiting, and Zurine Arctus cast a soul trap spell to rip Wulfharth's heart free and seal it inside a massive gem called the Mantella. That's where the Nord account puts its most vivid detail, the one piece that doesn't survive in any polished Imperial retelling. As Wulfharth's heart tore loose and flew into the Mantella, it tore straight back out through Zurine Arctus's own chest on the way, killing the battle mage in the same instant. 2 men died in that single moment, and whatever ended up sealed inside the Mantella wasn't simply Wulfharth's stolen power anymore, but something built from both of their deaths at once. Tiber Septim told the Elder Council that Arctus had died attempting a coup, buried the truth, and used the Mantella to finally activate Numidium, conquering Somerset Isle and completing the unification of Tamriel that the whole scheme had been built around. A separate, older strand of prophecy backs up the idea that more than one soul went into that throne, regardless of which 2 men are named. Centuries before any of it happened, both Vivec and the Khmer hero Nerevar independently reported the same vision during their travels through a realm called the Provisional House, a twin-headed king who contained multitudes, which Vivec's own teachings later identify as General Talos fused with his twin head, Zurine Arctus, joined as one being called the Enantiomorph to secure the throne of Tamriel. That version only counts 2 men rather than 3, but it agrees on the central point the Empire's coinage leaves out entirely. Whoever sits behind the name Talos, it was never only Tiber Septim alone. Even after the Mantella did its work, the story doesn't fully resolve into either a single villain or a clean death. When Tiber Septim's grandson Pelagius took the throne, an entity calling itself the Underking appeared and offered to help the new emperor rule, claiming it had been sent by Tiber himself, without ever clarifying which of the two dead men, or what combination of them, was actually speaking. The Empire has never had to settle the question, since it won the war that made the official story the only one stamped on coins and carved into temple walls, and the white gold Concordat now makes it a crime to worship Talos at all, regardless of which account of his making happens to be true. The Nords never stopped singing their version anyway: 3 men and 1 throne, a general's body, a dead king's borrowed storm, and a battle mage's heart torn out through his own chest to make room for someone else's. That's the pattern sitting underneath almost everything covered here. The games hand over a crafting material, a shout on a button press, a civil war with 2 recruiting officers, a moon overhead, and present each one as a finished, self-contained fact. The books underneath those things almost always tell a stranger, older, and far less settled story, one where different accounts contradict each other outright, records get destroyed on purpose, and the official version is usually just the one that happened to win. None of that makes the games wrong about anything, it just means the surface was never the whole story to begin with.